Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to this workshop on the financial and market issues that face the broadcasting and related industries. I want to welcome our web audience as well. This is being simultaneously webcast, and we will be able to take questions from our web audience as well as those here in the room. This is part of the series of workshops we'll be holding on the issues in connection with our review of our media ownership rules, which is required by law to be performed in 2010, and we are now in 2010, so we're well into it, having started it last fall. It goes without saying that broadcasting is undergoing a great change and is subject to many stresses that affect its financial health and its access to capital. Some of the issues that we hope to explore this morning are the extent to which those stresses are structural or cyclical, and in particular what role our media ownership rules play in affecting the financial health of broadcasters and the economic stresses they're facing. To help us explore these issues, we have two very distinguished panels of leaders in the broadcasting industry and the financial community. We're happy to have the different perspectives of those who are seeking financing and those who are deciding what to finance, as well as an analyst whose specialty is in evaluating investment opportunities. The workshop will be divided into two panels. We'll begin with a panel that will focus on the financial issues facing larger broadcasters and those in the larger media markets. Then, after a short break, we'll follow with a panel devoted to the issues that face the smaller broadcasters and those in smaller markets. We understand that the financing opportunities may differ between the large and small players and in the larger and smaller markets, and we hope to explore these differences as we go into our analysis of our media ownership rules. We'll begin each panel with a 10-minute presentation by each panelist, and then we'll raise some questions ourselves from the FCC staff, and we'll be happy to take questions from the live audience as well as the web audience. Those in the live audience who would like to ask questions, we will have 3x5 cards that will be passed up to the moderators, and we'll take the questions in that way. Very happy to welcome our first panel and have it led off by Brandon Burgess, who is the chairman and CEO of ION Media Networks. ION owns and operates the largest broadcast television station group, as well as ION Television, the country's only independent broadcast television network. Welcome, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you. You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having us here and for this opportunity to share our thoughts. I'll start with a couple of prepared remarks, and then happy to answer any questions you or the audience may have. ION Media Networks is pleased to have the opportunity to provide its perspective on the FCC review of its media ownership rules and the impact of the current economic and competitive climate on that process. My name is Brandon Burgess, and I've been the ION Chief Executive Officer since 2005. ION is one of the few surviving independent television broadcast networks. Our 59 television stations provide programming 24/7 to over 70 million TV households in the U.S., in addition to another nearly 30 million cable and satellite homes where we do not have stations. We are a truly independent broadcaster. We do not have an in-house production arm or movie studio, and we have no major network affiliations or ownership ties to cable or satellite distributors. ION is in a turnaround process that started about 3 years ago when the company was saddled with over $2.5 billion of debt from a prior regime and had no viable operating vision for its broadcast assets. Today, our company is debt-free after successfully completing a recapitalization backed by independent financial investors. And I'd like to go off script here for a moment, and on that note, thank the FCC and the Media Bureau in particular for really a very seamless and supportive way of handling that restructuring together with us. And thanks to you personally, Bill, for the support in that. Operationally, we are establishing ourselves as an innovative and entrepreneurial contributor in an increasingly vertically integrated television landscape. Our financial and operational progress is grounded in the belief that as a broadcaster, we need to become nimbler and humbler in embracing change and reinvent our business to adequately serve the 21st century digitally empowered and skilled consumers. Similarly, for the purpose of today's topic, we submit that we should not spend too much time on rules that attempt to legislate matters of declining marketplace relevance. Regulation designed to ensure that traditional outlets across various old media don't dominate yesterday's world does little to ensure that diverse, independent, and innovative players have a fair and equitable chance to compete on an increasingly vertically consolidated digital future. Horizontal consolidation across old media may be far less an impediment to competition and diversity today than nationwide vertical consolidation in unregulated segments of the video and digital marketplaces. Most TV broadcasters are in fact not owned by Big Four networks, do not own a newspaper, and are not vertically integrated with a program production studio, a cable or satellite provider, or a large telephone company. I encourage the Commission to look beyond consolidation at the top of the traditional media food chain and take into account the smaller and independent companies whose role in the media marketplace should be fully considered and protected on dimensions like fair access and pricing. The Commission should also consider incentives and support for companies like our own who show innovation and job creation and preservation in this economic climate. I might add that we did not create any unemployment or redundancies in the process of our financial restructuring, by the way. The digital television transition to DTV has given broadcasters an R&D development platform to bring new dimensions to traditional over-the-air television. Even during a time of economic duress, our company has not only made a point of fully embracing this innovation potential of DTV, but has done so in a close bipartisan cooperation with the Commission and with a constant eye towards the objective of being seen as a responsible broadcaster despite the financial challenges we've been working through. We're beginning to see the fruits of this approach, which from a product development perspective we like to evangelize among broadcasters as the DTV triple play. First, traditional broadcasting. ION has rolled out a high-definition quality version of its primary network as part of the 2009 digital transition. ION Television uses its main over-the-air broadcasting platform to offer a mix of hit television series, theatrical movies, and specials. With our financial restructuring behind us, we're also entering a phase of original production, including made-for-TV movies and specials, and you will see and hear more news from us on this front in coming months and years. Second, new digital channels. Digital technology enables us to provide viewers with multiple over-the-air streams of high-quality programming. ION currently uses this capability to offer two innovative digital channels dedicated to important demographics. First, together with partners including Scholastic and Chorus Entertainment, ION helped launch Cubo, the nation's only free over-the-air 24/7 nationally distributed children's programming service. Cubo provides a self-educational viewing destination for kids and their parents and treats the issue of advertising with heightened sensitivity to the childhood obesity epidemic. We have also collaborated with the FCC on this front. In addition, ION distributes the ION Life digital network, which is a digital network dedicated to the celebration of healthy and empowered lifestyles. The channel's program lineup includes health and wellness, competitive and lifestyle sports, as well as best-of series on travel, design, decor, shopping, family activities, and personal achievement. And thirdly, wireless DTV broadband video. One of the most innovative capabilities of DTV is its potential to take local broadcast television mobile. Mobile DTV has the potential to make broadcasters a valuable contributor to the wireless DTV broadband video marketplace. Mobile DTV promises to add an entirely new dimension to the over-the-air viewing experience and to transform digital broadcasting into mobile wireless broadband video delivery. ION has been a leader in the development of mobile DTV for our country, and I'm pleased to serve as the president of the Open Mobile Video Coalition, OMVC, an alliance of over 800 U.S. commercial and public broadcasters formed to accelerate the development and rollout of mobile DTV. Consumer surveys show a high degree of interest, particularly among young people, for mobile video offerings, and over-the-air broadcasters are uniquely positioned to provide it. The National Television Broadcast System and its focus on service to the public is the ideal medium for providing consumers with the local information and entertainment they desire on their mobile devices. I just returned from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, where we demonstrated, together with our OMBC partners, a wide range of new products that bring mobile DTV to consumers and reshape the way in which viewers watch television. One such product, the Tivit, in fact won various CES awards. I'm pleased to report that in just a few weeks, OMBC is launching a mobile DTV consumer showcase here in Greater Washington, D.C. 8 local television stations, including ION's WPXW DT, will participate in this program. Our expectation is that this showcase will be a giant step towards the road on the nationwide availability of mobile DTV. Unfortunately for broadcasters and the viewing public, the beginning of the DTV era coincided with a period of unprecedented financial hardship for the nation's television broadcasters. In the worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression, advertising revenues, which in our case are the sole source of revenue, all but disappeared in 2008 and 2009. The Commission should take today's challenging economic conditions into account as it reviews its broadcast regulation and examine whether the business is changing so fast that old rules may become not just obsolete, but a hindrance to much-needed modernization and employment. The Commission should also examine whether relaxing decades-old ownership rules might aid the broadcast television industry's recovery, competitiveness, and innovation. Equally importantly, the Commission should not further encumber broadcast ownership in the current economic environment, even if it believes that such restrictions might be warranted under normal economic circumstances. Introducing new ownership restrictions in an economic climate that threatens the economic survival of regulated industries seems misplaced. The FCC cannot control the economy, but it can make certain that when the economy turns around and the advertising industry bounces back, broadcasters have a regulatory foundation to improve television service to the public with DTV and to compete fairly in an evolving, developing marketplace. And in any event, the Commission's periodic review always ensures that the Commission will have opportunities to evaluate its rules every few years. The Commission asked whether lenders pay attention to the Commission's rules, and let me tell you that they do. Credit is already tight for broadcasters, weighed down by debts associated with the DTV transition, and will be further jeopardized in the face of new ownership restrictions. In closing, the guiding principle the Commission should use in evaluating its ownership regulation is that its rules should fairly position broadcasters relative to its often much larger and well-financed and consolidated media competition. The Commission's rules should let the marketplace pick the winners and losers, but also ensure that everyone, including small and independent players like ION, have a fair chance to realize their investment in serving consumers through broadcast innovation. DTV adds a valuable choice and technology dimension to the mobile broadband video market, and the Commission's ownership and other rules should ensure that that potential is nurtured, not squandered. ION continues to strive to offer viewers the best possible product within our financial means and consistent with our public interest obligations, as established by Congress and the Commission. We invite the FCC to address its ownership rules reviews not only to the big media players at the top of the food chain, but also for independents like ION and other small operators who work hard to contribute to a diverse and affordable television system for all Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burgess. Next, we're very happy to hear from James Cotter, the head of the Media and Telecommunications M&A practice at SunTrust Bank. Mr. Cotter heads a coverage group that has a relation-based practice involved in mergers, acquisitions, equity financing, and purchase and sale of entities in the broadcasting and radio station business. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. I think these remarks in some way will segue with Brandon's comments. One of the things I want to spend a few minutes focusing on is, how and why we spend time with certain sectors in the market, and then share with you some observations bridging back 5 years over the last review, and provide some data with respect to how the capital markets are looking at the sector today, as well as how they've looked at it over the last 5 years, and then tie that together with some thoughts on the implications of the review of cross-ownership rules. See if I can get this working. That's just, first page is just a note on myself, but what I'd like to do first is spend a moment just taking a snapshot. SunTrust Robinson Humphrey is the investment banking arm of SunTrust Bank, and we have flexibility as we focus on the media and communications sector, which we also regularly review, and about where we want to spend our time and where we want to deploy our capital. So the reason I put this up here is each of these verticals are places where either we've historically put capital or where we are choosing to put capital going forward. And so if you look back 5 years, I think you'd see the preponderance of our time and energy and capital was in more what we call traditional media: radio, broadcasting, TV networks, publishing, cable. What we're focusing on now, and what you see right at the center of our efforts today, are competitive telecom fiber and data centers, internet infrastructure. And what those are, which is really, I think, at the heart of this discussion, is the infrastructure, the pipes and the processors that carry digital media. So we're moving away from newspapers, generally pulling back, as is the entire market, on traditional broadcasters, cable television, less so cable, because cable is essentially also your internet pipe. But broadcast television, radio, and publishing, where there's been a tremendous amount of struggle in the debt capital markets due to distressed operations. So we're joined by a team of 4 other senior bankers that cover various sectors. And now to the meat of the story. So if we look back 5 years, and what I want to do is just spend a minute on taking you down the balance sheet of and how the capital markets look from the most senior or safest securities down through the equity layer. So the first chart shows the media loan syndications volume. So this is the amount of dollars that were raised in the sector in a given quarter. So if we go back, we can see at the right when the subprime credit crunch started in 3Q07, the loan market fell off a cliff. So this makes it incredibly difficult, both for consolidation as well as refinance, for media companies in general. And you can see since then, things haven't gotten better. They've essentially gotten worse or dried up completely. And so, is that because of media ownership rules? No, it's because, in large part, there was, and this is something that capital markets tend to do also, there was a tremendous amount of, probably in retrospect, excess leverage deployed. Companies were leveraged to a point where they couldn't survive a down cycle. But as we look today, I think there's also a sense that we're looking at a perfect storm. So there's a macro recession, which has led to a reduction in advertising revenue. There is also an overwhelming explosion and a new competitive threat from various online advertising vehicles, as well as online media consumption. So it's tougher for operators to run a profitable business. At the same time, they find themselves very levered. And that leads, first of all, to investors completely pulling back. So you also can't get new capital to bridge through till the recession turns. So if we go a page further, the light blue line there, you can see in 06 and 07 is the bank and institutional market, or loans, if you will. And again, we're looking at sequential quarterly volume. And you can see this giant bulb in the middle, and then that falls off the cliff, similar to the earlier chart. But what you see down below is that the whole period, high yield bonds, or the next layer down of the capital structure, were really on they were almost squeezed out of the market. There was so much loans, which tend to be cheaper, that there was no appetite from issuers for high yield bonds. Now we see very here at the end this uptick, and if you wonder why that is, that's because operators that have survived are trying to extend the due date of their loans out, and they're replacing loans that are in place with high yield bonds in order to give them the sort of runway they need to get out of this recession. Now we get to pricing. So this chart here, I don't think we need to dwell too much on the numbers here, but this chart here reflects the cost, not necessarily the total cost, but the cost for the investor, what the investor charges to loan to a media company. So they borrow at, the base rate is L or LIBOR, and you can see for a long time they wanted about 300 basis points or a 3% spread between the base rate to loan to a media company. Well, you can see the disruption. Two things happen on the right side of this chart. One is that there's no data, so that means no one was doing any new loans, which makes it very tough on operators. And the other is that cost is skyrocketing. Now, for the time being, that's manageable because the base rate, LIBOR, has gone down and very low, so the actual net cost on a given day to an issuer has increased less than this chart shows, but it's also essentially a variable rate environment, so there's a tremendous risk that the cost is going to go up and stay up as LIBOR comes off the floor. Here again, this illustrates the last point. If you look at the chart across the top, that's the LIBOR rate, and you can see where it peaked out at about 5.23, 5.3, and now it's gone down to 0.83. So that is the piece. As we go forward and as we come out of the recession, that's at risk of going back up. The fixed piece is the dark blue bar, which you can see has already skyrocketed. So essentially, you add the two bars for the total cost, and a loan that would be about 5% today, if LIBOR drifted back to normal rates, could double in its cost to the operator. Now, this is the chart that you don't want to see increasing as you go from left to right. This is a rear view mirror look at the number of loans in the market that have payments in default, so at risk of bankruptcy. They're no longer able to comply with the original covenants they agreed to with their lenders. So we had information up through the third quarter of 2009, and you can see this has skyrocketed, and if we rolled on the fourth quarter, it would look worse, not better. Continuing with the cheery part of the story here, we've broken down the sector into three pieces, and we've taken a look at a couple of different metrics in order to orient you as to how equity investors both have realized returns over the last few years, as well as how the market looks today. So you can see the top line again, down 83% in radio. Earnings are also down. So what's encouraging is that the multiple or the adjusted price of these equities has kind of come back to a long-term average. So it was high, and then it was very low, and now it's come back. And we see a similar story with newspaper and a similar story with television. So where do we go from here? I think in general, it's clear to say that today, more so than sectors that have rebounded, the senior debt markets are constrained, and there's a significant reduction in investor appetite. So not only is it more expensive, less investors are willing to invest in the sector. The high yield market is open, but really only to the strongest issuers. Total debt multiples are the amount you can borrow. If you think about a house where you used to be able to borrow 80% of the purchase price, now you can only borrow 50%. That's what a media operator is also, a broadcaster is also experiencing. In the operating environment, there's just an explosion of new competition. The digital world, I think particularly in the last 5 years, has radically accelerated as a competitive threat. All of the things that people fantasized about in the 90s, are now reality. They're in our pockets, on our BlackBerries, and on our TVs. And part and parcel of that, the public policy objective or the threat of concentrated ownership is greatly diminished. News in today's world is completely ubiquitous. You can get it anywhere. The problem more is that it's available everywhere for free rather than there being a material threat of someone monopolizing the voice of a community. Entertainment program is rapidly flowing through an increasingly number of distribution channels. And again, I think very quickly on the horizon, we're also going to see the same thing that we've seen with information. So in closing, I think that a lessening of the ownership rules to allow business people in each community to try and figure out what combination of newspaper, radio, or television, or what amalgamation of market works or does not work, is something that we would encourage the committee to evaluate. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Brian Rich, Managing Partner of Catalyst Investors. Catalyst has historically invested in both broadcast companies and newspapers, and he can share its perspective on the changes occurring in those industries and what those changes imply for our media ownership rules. Mr. Rich.
Thanks. Thank you, Bill. I have a couple of comments to read, and then I look forward to questions. My background is actually quite similar to Jim's. I started some years ago as a lender to large broadcast, cable, wireless, and publishers at one of the largest media and communications banks. In the mid-1990s, I broadened my focus to growth equity, where my interests included classic media, as well as cellular, telephony, and spectrum investments. More recently, our firm, Catalyst Investors, has been focused on digital media and other internet-driven businesses, as that is where the growth is, and we are growth equity investors. Given my background, it should be no surprise that I believe the broadcast sector needs to be looked at holistically and in combination with wired and wireless digital media in order to gain a full perspective when considering how to regulate it. My comments will reflect this perspective. Broadcast, generically, has gone past its growth phase through a massive consolidation period. It is an industry which is now mature. The industry has fundamentally changed and is not going back to the old days. 2009 saw an extraordinary decline in advertising dollars due to the recession. I believe, however, that the decline in advertising as a percentage of GDP, which was 2.4% in 2000, is at 1.9% today, and that decline is permanent. Cable and the internet have eroded broadcast TV's and radio's pricing power, although the good news is that I believe this effect is diminishing. Broadcasters' increasing cable carriage fees are also a positive, as are the inroads broadcasters are making into digital media, although still quite small at less than 5% of total revenues. However, in the long run, broadband will have a deteriorating effect on broadcast viewership, and wireless services will negatively influence radio listenership. There are some factors that will cause this trend to happen. First, mobile internet is exploding. There has been a 50 times increase in data traffic in the last 3 years, at least in the case of AT&T and the iPhone. On-demand video and audio streaming will be seamlessly integrated into automobiles. Features like two-way interaction and location-based services cannot be replicated by broadcast. Powerful new publishing and distribution platforms like Facebook, which crossed the 100 million user mark in November, YouTube and Twitter, will continue to take advertising dollars away from broadcast. Thirdly, disruptive broadcast distribution providers like Netflix, Hulu, and other forms of direct viewership through the internet will continue to increase timeshare away from broadcast. More of the ad share and margin will flow back to the big diversified media companies and therefore the larger markets and away from the smaller affiliates and smaller markets. Broadcasters must continue to adapt in order to survive and return to growth. To date, this has largely been done as a function of cost reductions. I think Brandon alluded to that, which were necessary, but going forward, broadcasters will have to invest in alternative revenue streams as well. I would also advocate out-of-the-box thinkings, and I have a couple of examples, which I'm sure will be fodder for conversation. Television, to my earlier point, the value of a TV station as a distributor of content is being commoditized. Much of the value creation going forward will be based upon news, sports, and other local content being created by the broadcaster. This should be encouraged. In addition, the local TV broadcaster needs to consider other ways to distribute its content. Obviously, this means over the internet, but also through existing and future wireless broadband networks. In the case of radio, while almost ubiquitous in an analog world, has far less reach in a digital one. I understand there's an effort under consideration to mandate that radio tuners are placed in cell phones. This idea is an interesting one, particularly as a precursor to a digital solution for radio broadcasters. It is important to maintain localism. To Jim's point, debt and equity providers, both public and private, are largely disinterested in radio and TV broadcast sectors today. The question is, what will it take for capital providers to once again embrace the industry? Historically, these capital sources, of which I was one, were attracted to broadcast because of the franchise value of their licenses. The limited competitive environment allowed for predictable revenues, cash flow, and high margins with modest capital investment. Radio and TV were by and large long-term growth businesses. None of these facts are now true. The broadcast spectrum, however, remains extraordinarily valuable. For instance, the 700 megahertz auction a couple of years back garnered $19 billion of proceeds, or over $1 per megahertz pop. However, the franchise value of the broadcast license, when used for the purpose of broadcast TV, has been diminished due to the advent of the technologies I've just described. This reduction in stick value is a big negative from a lender's perspective. Large cap broadcasters aside, there is little or no equity value in the sector. Valuation multiples have been permanently impaired. Where double-digit multiples of broadcast cash flow, or BCF, were the norm historically, the new normal is significantly less, perhaps as low as 4 times BCF in some cases. The industry will have to work through its debt load, which includes costly syndicated programming. I believe that the resulting industry leverage should be no more than 2 to 3 times, which conforms with the 50% I think that Jim talked about. There has been and will be more bankruptcies and restructurings to accomplish this delevering. Following this workout period, capital providers will need to be convinced that broadcasting is once again a stable, long-term, predictable business with multiple revenue streams. I believe that the regulatory environment during this next upcoming cycle can have a profound impact on the future of broadcasting going forward. It's my view that there should be relaxation of the ownership limits and cross-ownership rules, particularly between newspapers and broadcasters. I believe doing so would benefit the public as well as the broadcast and print industries. I say this for 2 reasons. First, I believe that given the multitude of information sources, including online, short-form video, blogging, and others, the effective number of voices in a market can no longer be measured simply by broadcasters and newspapers. Therefore, the existing rules do not consider the marketplace as a whole. Second, without change, both the newspaper and broadcast industries will continue to suffer greatly, and many stations, both radio and TV, will not survive. This will cause the remaining product to weaken from a quality and diversity perspective. It would be unfortunate if such voices diminish through inaction. Local market content must be able to survive, so allowing producers to achieve the necessary scale to do so is crucial. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rich. Last but by no means least, we will hear from Marcy Ryvicker, a broadcast and cable analyst at Wells Fargo Securities. Ms. Ryvicker is a close observer of the current financial markets for broadcasting as well as cable and satellite. Ms. Ryvicker.
Thank you. I'm going to start out this morning by providing you with some facts and analysis. Fact number 1, consumer behavior in the United States has changed drastically over the past decade. Today, over 90% of our population owns a cell phone versus 28% 10 years ago. Today, 23% or almost a quarter of U.S. households are cell phone-only households versus virtually none 10 years ago. Today, over 20% of our population owns a PDA or a smartphone versus none 10 years ago. Fact number 2, consumption of media has changed drastically over the past decade. Today, there are nearly 10 million iPhones versus none 10 years ago. Today, approximately 30% of TV households are DVR-enabled versus less than 5% 10 years ago. Today, roughly 45% of viewers tune into broadcast primetime television versus over 70% 10 years ago. Today, over 170 million consumers watch video over the internet versus less than 1 million over 10 years ago. Today, less than 50% of all adults read newspapers versus over 60% 10 years ago. And today, 65% of this country utilizes internet broadband versus less than 25% 10 years ago. And fact number 3, the competitive environment has changed drastically over the past decade. Today, there are 565 cable networks versus 171 10 years ago. Today, there are hundreds of millions of internet sites versus less than 50 10 years ago. And today, only half of the U.S. population watches local broadcast TV news versus nearly 2/3 or 66% 10 years ago. So as you can see, this country has changed, and more specifically, the consumers in this country have changed. And as a result, the regulations surrounding media ownership rules must change. When I look at traditional media, there is no denying that there are both cyclical and secular challenges. The cyclical challenges are tailwinds at this point, but the secular challenges remain headwinds. And in my opinion, broadcasters cannot catch a break. These companies, which lease spectrum from the FCC, are required to use these licenses in the best interest of the public good. But current regulations are not letting this happen in today's environment. Relaxing the media ownership rules should result in both operational and financial efficiencies, leading to crucial investment in areas that are beneficial to the public, new media initiatives, mobile TV, high-definition programming, and these are just a few. By blocking consolidation among certain parties, profits and cash flow are adversely impacted. Dollars that can be used to serve the public are being wasted unnecessarily. A lot of the concerns that were valid years ago made sense years ago. There was a valid fear that a combination of groups, whether it be across or within various media, would result in biased opinions and unfair market prices. But I look today at the state of the traditional media industry, and I wonder what could have happened to radio, to newspapers, and to television had the regulations been modified at an earlier date. Just going back to 2000, radio revenue is down by 20%. Broadcast television revenue is basically flat, and newspaper revenue is down by 43%. In combination, these three media have lost $24 billion in revenue since 2000. Now, I don't like to focus on the past, and so all we can do is move forward and appropriately amend the rules to make traditional media the best that it can be. So before I get off my soapbox, I do have some suggestions looking at the rules. First, the local television ownership limit. When I look at the 8 voices test, I believe it should be eliminated altogether. It should not just be amended. Why does it make sense to define a market solely by the number of TV stations when clearly there are abundant outlets for consumers to access both content and local news? If you insist on keeping the 8 voices test, why not expand it to include all media outlets in a market, especially those that provide news such as cable networks, internet sites, and even radio stations? Moving to the Big 4 test, if not eliminate it, why not modify it to the Big 3? Fox does not have the same profile as the other 3 networks. Yes, it has good programming, as we know, we've all heard of American Idol, but the amount of local news is limited to the other networks. Maybe 2 hours at most Fox has in a top market, and 1 hour of news outside of the top 20 markets versus 4.5 hours of local news produced by other networks on average. Moving to the local radio ownership limit, why not expand the rules to allow for further consolidation in all markets? Let market forces determine the appropriate number of radio stations owned by a specific group in a market. And lastly, turning to the newspaper broadcast and radio television cross-ownership rules. I believe these should be decided on a case-by-case basis, rather than simply blanketing rules to all constituents. I appreciate this opportunity to get in front of you, and I look forward to the changes to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we kick off the questioning, I'll just invite each of the speakers in turn to make any comments they may have on what they've heard from the other panelists. and then we'll proceed with questioning. Mr. Burgess.
Well, all I can say, Bill, I found this to be rather gratifying to listen to this because, as you'll note, I actually was not quite as explicit about ownership changes. I think I look at this from a perspective of we have to reinvent ourselves. But to hear the investing community be pretty explicit about that they will not invest under these circumstances, I think that's really where the world is. It doesn't so much matter what I think from the inside of a company. We're doing everything we can to earn our right to receive capital, and we did receive a little bit, although not as much as I think we'll ultimately want and need. But I think the investing community, I think, is setting the tone at this point and helping us understand why changes are going to be needed. So I find this to be a very interesting panel.
Yeah, I think contrary to what it sounded like, we did not get together and have breakfast and coordinate our remarks. But that's even more powerful statement, I think, for completely disinterested voices coming pretty much to a similar place. And so as the Commission thinks about these rules, I think the most important factor here is not what debt costs or how much you can get. Those are observations, but not necessarily what should drive public policy. But I think the secular changes and the overwhelming and accelerating revolutionizing of, how people consume media, is a complete paradigm shift that we have now experienced. I think we've been talking about it for 15 or 20 years. Since the last review, it's really accelerated. So as you think about the rules, I would encourage you to, take a fresh piece of paper and not necessarily saying, how do we, tinker with what we've been doing for a long time, but really step back and say, what is the public policy, purpose here, and how are we achieving it in a world that looks nothing like it did even 5 years ago?
Yeah, it was interesting to me when I listened to Marcy go through the stats. I think I knew most of the stats, but when you hear them all at once and you go through it, it's just remarkable. And I think the question at hand is, how do you make this an interesting industry again going forward, and how do you return it to growth? And we went through a horrible time this last 12 or 18 months, which was a sort of one-time thing, we all hope, but then there's just these fundamental changes that we have to accept and deal with and figure out how to make it interesting again as an industry going forward.
And I would say that, I think we're all in favor of the broadcast industry and the newspaper industry succeeding, and it takes a number of parties to actually make this happen. And so you can hear from 4 completely different people that we're all kind of in the same camp, and how we get there, I guess we need help from the regulators.
Thank you. Sarah Weitzel of the Media Bureau will launch our questioning.
I wanted to follow up on the extent to which current ownership rules affect financing decisions. To what extent do the limits of what a company can do influence your valuation of the company?
Sure. I think specifically, if you say how does the ownership limits affect valuation, valuation is a function of, what investors are paying for other similar properties. So you can look at it fundamentally, but we look at what other companies trade for. So it has an effect on the whole industry because it constricts the flexibility in markets. And M&A is my business, but believe me, I've seen it work and not work. And so it's not a let's do more M&A argument or let's consolidate argument, because there's lots of stories where consolidation has been a productive exercise, and one of the things we've seen a lot of it. So there's lots of consolidation that's gone on despite ownership rules. But what I hear from operators is, in some markets, we need to get the advertising sales force with the television station coordinating with the newspapers so that we can attack the market in a more intelligent fashion. And in other circumstances, operators say, well, we tried that and it didn't work at all. But I think what what would help valuation and help get lenders more comfortable is what lenders are saying is the competitive universe is too strong for you to compete in a lot of cases. So that's led all investors up and down the balance sheet to pull back. So we used to be willing to loan 6, 7 times, your cash flow, because we knew it was going to be there tomorrow. And I think what investors have said is, we don't think it's going to be there anymore. And now we're willing to lend between 0 in many cases and 4 times. So I wouldn't say that it's gone from 8 to 4. I said in many cases, many cases, it's 0. There just isn't any investor appetite. So what could the rules do to valuation? Relaxing the rules on cross ownership could allow for a variety of new business models that are appropriate for certain situations to be created that investors could get excited about.
Yeah, I would say there's sort of 2 components to it. So getting back to the point of how do you get the valuations back up again? First of all, it's not going to happen by itself, if at all, because the industry's just changed, which is sort of the common theme here. But you just look at, there's really 2 components. It's revenue and revenue growth. Are we in growth or are we in decline? Growth commands a greater multiple than decline, as you would expect. Expenses. How can we temper expenses? If you allow combinations, whether across industry or within industry, would that then allow you to have some expense savings? Can you combine news departments? Can you combine writers? Can you combine sales force? Possibly, maybe not. Can you get more pricing stability on a revenue side if you allow further combinations? And then will the product get better so that more people will watch or listen, as the case may be?
Now, I don't do M&A. I can't, being an equity analyst, but I do evaluate the deals and how it impacts the stock prices. And in terms of what I do is I speak a lot to operators. I speak a lot to the investing community. And it appears to me that a lot of focus is on cash flow. And by relaxing the ownership rules, there's a belief that cash flow will be able to expand because there will be synergies in markets, whether it's a combination of the same media or across media, where unnecessary costs will be eliminated, cash flow will increase, and more lenders will come to the table at higher prices, and investors will reevaluate the sector. So I think that's the way that media ownership rules can help if they're relaxed.
If I can also give you one example, which is sort of real example from the last couple of months in our company's example, just to give you a sense for sort of unintended consequences of some of the older rules. There was this issue of the limitations on financing you can receive from sources that are otherwise invested in certain regulated parts of radio or print. So the combination of if somebody has a 5% equity interest in another attributable business, they can't have an investment in us, for example, and that's sort of equity ownership. And then there is the debt plus equity, 32% or whatever it is. So in our situation, we were raising, and we ended up succeeding, equity and recapitalizing the company, but we had to significantly work the group because there were some investors that also had minority positions in other media entities, and there was absolutely no intent at all that we would work with those other companies operationally at all. It was just sort of a paper rule, so we had to actually modify our financing structure, and we had to excuse one of the investors who wanted to invest capital because they had a 5% or something interest in some other broadcaster, which we're totally unrelated to and have no intention of really working with. So I think some of those legacy rules have to perhaps be examined in light of what my co-panelists here are saying. It's hard enough to come by credit and equity to begin with, and if you make the universe even smaller on the financial side, because these guys are portfolio investors, so they basically spread money among different asset classes, and if they have an investment in a 5% investment in some other broadcaster, they could not invest in us, for example, in the future. So I think that's a real limitation that I think is sort of past its time. And then the other, where it also becomes an issue, and that's if you're just trying to raise money from purely financial investors. And then there's obviously the question of if you want to raise money from strategic investors, you run into that issue even more oftenly. So if nothing else, what one should figure out is if the issue of the 5% equity rule and the debt plus equity rule should be at least harmonized, such that dichotomy goes away, right? So if people can at least own up to 30%, for example, that would meaningfully relax your sourcing of capital, and that's obviously stopped short of certain rules going away entirely, which I don't disagree with. I'm just saying, I'm just alerting you to certain nuances where you can at least make things a little bit easier at the margin.
We heard somewhat from Ms. Rybaker on this point, but would relaxation of certain rules, in your view, have a greater impact than other? I'm hearing consistently the cross-ownership rules are a particular focus. Do others of you have more specific thoughts on that?
Well, the cross-ownership rules are usually the very first question. So whenever you call someone and, what would you think about combining with so-and-so? The very first question is the regulatory question. And that's a little odd if you think about it, in different industries, that, that's the number one, business point that people bring up.
The number one hindrance.
Well, it's just the number. It's not always a hindrance, but it's the number one. So if you can't get by the cross ownership rules, the conversation's over. And so I think we're, shorting ourselves on opportunities because people would find constructive ways to combine businesses and create new business models more often, but the door is often shut. First of all, the competitive threat: is there a duopoly in the market? Is one of the the instant first questions you hear. And secondly is, could I, effectively create a competitor?
Yeah, I think Marcy's comment was looking at cross-ownership on a case-by-case basis, and I don't know exactly what you had in mind, but I think that that's true from an economic, or investor standpoint as well. So for instance, if I'm a broadcaster in a particular market and there's a newspaper that's marginal, more perhaps cash flow negative, I'm not necessarily running to merge with them because I'm just not sure what that's going to do. It's not clear that putting them together puts the newspaper over the line, for instance, right? And so the last thing you want to do if you're, in yourself, focused on trying to get your own cash flow to stabilize, the last thing you want to do is then go make your job harder to go do that. On the other hand, if that particular property is more interesting, if on its own merits it's doing okay, if it's invested in digital and that's going well, or if you see a future towards doing that, or if alternately from a cost perspective, you say, you sit down and you look at putting those two businesses together, and you can convince yourself that you can pull enough cost out of it and that you've got enough readership going forward, then that would be more interesting. I understand it's difficult to regulate that, but I think that that's sort of how it is.
Are you suggesting regulators should consider on a case-by-case basis what the financial?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the marketplace will figure out if I'm, for instance, a broadcaster in a market and I've got to make it. If I'm permitted to merge with a newspaper, for instance, I then need to make a commercial decision, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
But when I hear you advocate for case-by-case examination, Ms. Rybaker, I could think sometimes our assumption is that the financial industry would prefer just the opposite. They would prefer more bright line rules.
I think looking at this economically, every company is different, every company's strengths is different. And we've seen some mergers succeed and some mergers fail. Unfortunately, over the past year or two, we've seen a couple of big mergers fail. You saw ABC and Citadel. Citadel is now bankrupt in the radio industry. But I think that there are other smaller operators where if you're in a market and you could merge with the newspaper, you could realize some synergies. And so if you, not have necessarily the investor say yes or no, this is going to succeed on a case-by-case basis, but the companies that want to merge prove to you or provide to the public that this is in the best interest. So instead of using a decade-old rule and saying nothing can happen, if there is a circumstance where it would improve the marketplace, yes, let it happen.
I think that the case-by-case analysis wouldn't have anything to do with the financial element of whether the transaction makes sense or not, but either a much lower bar or a case-by-case analysis of, is there any, again, public policy threat from this transaction? So are we really squelching the, is there only going to be one voice in this community? And the big theme I think you heard is in any, lower medium to large size community in this country, you can get news and we're overwhelmed with voices. So, where is the threat? Now there may be some situations in smaller communities with less media outlets where there is still a policy reason to make sure that one voice doesn't dominate the community. But I think I would start from scratch again, as opposed to saying it's a bad idea to have one entity own too many radio stations or TV and a newspaper in New York City.
Let me also add a comment, because there's always, in these panels, and I don't do many of these, but I always suspect there's a concern that when you voice a certain opinion, it's sort of a self-interested opinion. Let me give you a perspective on this. If there were no newspaper, radio, television ownership rules at all, our company would have no interest in acquiring newspapers. That's just a personal strategic view I have. And so, we would look at this and say, so you should ask yourself, does ION, and we consider ourselves, by the way, a small independent player. I know we're on the big market, big broadcaster panel, but that's not how we feel. The big broadcasters, I assure you, are not at this panel, right? I mean, we all know who they are. So we have no, I have no objection to News Corp owning the Wall Street Journal. I have no particular objection to somebody in a local market owning a newspaper and a television station. I don't believe that's where the business is. If somebody can find a business model out of that makes a particular entity healthier, that's great. I think that's probably good for the entire asset class, and it actually probably indirectly helps me too. A, it tells me that I guess my strategy was wrong, and B, it probably helps fundraising. So I think enabling the free market a little bit to play out, I think, is valuable for everybody. Even we have no goal of acquiring radio or newspaper property. So just to give you a sort of a different point of view, our business model is more geared towards pursuing new media, monetizing spectrum, going after wireless applications, those sorts of things. So just as a comparison.
Mr. Rich posed an interesting question, or a primary question of what will it take for investors to embrace this industry again? And I wanted to seek some of your other views on the answer to that question. And you talked about some of the things that need to be established, like long-term potential of the industry, but how does someone like Mr. Burgess demonstrate that? And do you have reactions, in fact, to what he's doing?
Yeah. Investors, generally speaking, like businesses that are going up. Businesses that are going down is hard. And there are people who specialize in that, and I don't think any of them are sitting at the table here today. So fundamentally, you want to figure out how to return the industry to growth again. I mean, for years, when I was a lender and then more active investor in the sector, it was a very easy industry to invest in. It had a protected franchise in the form of a license. It had limited competition, very high operating margins, generally speaking, some more than others. And that's what made it an interesting business. And oh, by the way, if you had a bad management team, you could fix it. And if you really couldn't figure it out, there was a value known as a stick value that you felt, particularly as a lender, that you could fall back on. And so that's not there anymore. So the question is, what can you do? And I think in terms of, you listen again to the statistics, and in terms of just the core business, that's not going back to growth. At most we think that's going back, to growth based on GDP, at most. So you have to then look at what are the alternative revenue streams that the industry, can garner. And, I think there's a couple of examples of digital broadcast that Brandon has sitting there that are interesting. I think the idea of taking the product and putting the product on the cellular network is an interesting one. I talked about, in the case of radio, the idea about putting the signal onto the cell phone in some form in a preferred fashion. Those kind of things. I think there are a lot of ideas that people have talked about, and many of them are interesting.
Can I just follow up on that? I wanted to follow up on something that Mr. Burgess said about DTV streams and the ability to do additional programming as a result of the DTV transition. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts your financing abilities, your ability to get financing? Is that something that's increasing the value of broadcasters? And can you also talk about a little how you think we should take that into account when we talk about rules, in particular, the idea of additional voices that those streams might represent, or at least additional outlets when we get to counting in a market?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question for us. I'm glad you asked it. I don't know if it's exactly inside the scope of this rulemaking, but I could talk to you for many hours about that. Our company's view is that that we're in a time of a bit of a temporary overreaction to, or perhaps temporarily underestimating just how meaningful a part broadcasting is of the television landscape. I think everybody's beaten down, everybody's in the recession, everybody's struggling right now, and certainly we are and have been. But there's also some bright spots that I think we have to remind ourselves of. I think one of the brightest spots for our company was June 12th, 2009. The digital transition, which went seamlessly, turned the lights on in various parts of our business. The conventional wisdom that our digital streams don't generate revenue is simply false. Since the digital transition, we are seeing revenue that is pacing towards being somewhere between probably more than 5% of our revenues in this year, if the pacing holds. And that is, by the way, without the regulatory support that we were hoping to get when we started some of those businesses. And frankly, we structured some of those businesses with FCC objectives in mind, things like public interest, children, those sorts of things, EI. So I am disappointed with the lack of support that we've received to prop up these businesses and get them off the ground as new voices in the market. It is, and I'm not sitting here to complain, but since you threw me the softball, I have to jump on it. Right, there is simply something wrong if on your cable system at home you're getting 24 Viacom channels for which you have to pay, I don't know, $3, $4, $5, $6 whether you like it or not, and then the word is there's no space left for some of the free over-the-air public interest sort of driven channels that we provide. That's wrong. Now, but I'm not, again, even without that, we're seeing some encouraging developments there. There's a little bit of revenue there, and I think that's a very good development. So I think that is something that does help the multiple revenue stream vision that broadcasters have to have. And then the other factor that people have to keep in mind, and I would echo what Rich said in terms of Brian, I should say. Brian Rich said. In terms of bearing in mind, there's this whole, I mean, I hear all the stats about new media, but a new stat is also that in 2009, Nielsen came back out and said there is more television viewing per household than ever before in history, more than 8 hours per day per average household. And say, even if it's only 40% of that is attributable to broadcast, broadcasters are nowhere near compensated equitably for their contribution to that viewing. Right? So over 90% of the average television cost per household, which is say $60, $70, over 90% of that goes to non-broadcast providers. So there's a leveling opportunity over time. This is going to take years, many years, to come to a more a market-driven pricing equalization. And that's, I think, another important leveling factor for the broadcast community. So I think I'm digressing a little bit, but it's hard to talk about the incremental voices and the free offerings that are out there, and also the question of how that benefits the consumers from a viewing and from a pricing perspective. So.
And I can take that to the investment community and say that the equity investors and the debt investors really do not attribute any value to the digital spectrum at this point. Even though there's value and there's revenue, an equity investor does not call me and say, hey, how much could this contribute to the business, in 5 years? So that's something that I think can and should evolve and can help the broadcast industry.
I wanted to shift the discussion a little to what factors investors are considering in the limited capital provision that they are engaged in. Are there certain types of broadcasters that they're more likely to provide capital to, and what are the factors?
Well, if you're talking about debt capital markets, then I think that, so go back to what I said in my comments, so the industry is going through this massive delevering process now, and multiples have been eroded. So you have to take the debt level down. Some of it's going to be that the banks are going to own it for a little while, and then it's going to go back, and then private investors and lenders will end up, recapitalizing the companies. And when they do so, they're going to look at, from a risk standpoint, from a lending perspective. Now I'm talking about. So they're looking at diversified cash flow, broad, do you have a lot of signals, as in the case of an ION? Do you have a lot of markets that are broadcast cash flow positive? What do you think the outlook for the advertising market is in each of the respective markets? I think I agree with Marcy totally. I don't think they're at all thinking about the 5% of the digital broadcast at the moment. It's probably the last thing on their mind. They're looking at cable carriage fees as potential upside. And then from an investing perspective, it's sort of the same thing. Are you running out a model that's showing a long-term decline in cash flow, which gives you one result, or are you trying to figure out a model that's flat or rising, which would give you an entirely different result? But I think for the moment they're doing the former and not the latter.
But in looking at a particular entity, would something like a newspaper cross-ownership make you more likely to invest, or some other factor?
It may or may not, because there are models of both that have worked. And so I think the point from the business perspective is some managers may be able to say, in this market, if we can go to market with a broad product, that we can be effective. And also if we can consolidate our news gathering organization. So if we have one news gathering organization, feeding a newspaper and a broadcast television station, that's just half the cost. But that is in no way, shape, or form, a panacea, and in a lot of places it hasn't worked. So investors aren't saying this model works and this model doesn't work. They're saying, what is the market position of this particular entity that we're looking at? And is that defensible? What is my risk? If I'm going to loan you money, what is my chances of getting it back? If those are not good, then you're just not going to get a loan today. But so I think in the market, it's a case-by-case basis, because the underlying opportunity to monetize your product is going to be different in a small community, a rural community, a urban community, because they're all facing a different degree of competitive threats. And that's not a regulatory issue. That's an issue for business people in all these different communities to figure out.
We have a question from the web that asks if any of you have seen any trends that back up the view that minority radio and TV broadcasters have been more harshly affected by this downturn and are less likely to get capital.
My understanding is that minority ownership is extraordinarily low anyway. I think it may be perhaps even a better question for the second panel on smaller markets, because I think that that's probably a higher percentage of minority ownership. I haven't seen that it's necessarily been more adversely affected than just non-minority ownership, but it's, I think that minority ownership in general is just unfortunately low, and that's a whole, different topic, but it would be nice to think that at some point in the future we could figure out a way to increase minority and small business, smaller cap sort of ownership in the sector.
Sure. I wanted to start with a question that was sent in from the audience, which is a key issue for the FCC is independent local news production. Consolidation will probably reduce the number of news operations. So can you say the remaining news operations will be higher quality, or will cost savings be passed on to the shareholders?
Well, it'd be great if you could just say, we're just going to pass all the costs on the shareholders, but that type of analysis misses the critical element. Is it's a highly competitive consumer market for news. So what's going to determine what the shareholders ultimately receive is how good a job management does in delivering a quality product. So if you're in a mid-sized city and you have your own news organization, are you delivering news that is attracting people? Is it relevant, et cetera? That's what's going to make the differentiation. So if you have more dollars available and there's not two people covering the local sports team and two people doing this, there's an opportunity for you to do more with it and attract more purchasers or consumers to your product. And that then trickles down to shareholders. If you're burdened by your cost structure, then you can't innovate, you can't expand, you can't improve your product if your costs are higher. So I think that's the bigger differentiator.
I don't think that this is an either or scenario. I think we sit from outside looking in as financial people, but when I talk to operators, and the best operators, they focus on their first customer, which is their audience. And so if they produce programming that is of a level that's going to attract a greater audience, the advertising dollars come, and then the shareholders benefit because the equity goes up. So it's a partnership. It's not I'm going to take this money and put it here, and it's not going to go over here. So it definitely is a partnership that happens.
I think Mr. Rich mentioned in your comments that you thought one of the key differentiating factors going forward is going to be the quality or quantity of local content. Is that a change? Do you feel that the new marketplace is increasing, decreasing, or leaving the same the relative importance of local news creation in terms of valuation and access to capital?
By and large, I would say localism is increasingly important for a couple of reasons. One is that you now have with the internet so many wonderfully diversified sources of national and international news and programming and otherwise that you can pick up regardless of where you are. So the broadcaster's point of differentiation in the market is that of localism, really. So I think that will become increasingly important. Of course, for news, local coverage of sports, activities going on in the community, and then also, to the extent that they can afford to do it, local, entertainment-based things. But it's all hard to do. It's easy to say and really hard to do because it's expensive. And so, that's why if we're able to have a couple of stronger competitors, they're better able to afford those kind of things.
Can I follow up on that? Just as it relates to our rules in particular, there's historically a lot of concern that relaxation of the media ownership limitations will result in increased consolidation, which will result in less localism. Yeah. That the giant conglomerates that are not in their local communities are not going to use their digital streams to improve local content, are not going to increase local news. Can you comment on that, or anybody?
I think it's a risk, and I think it's something you have to consider as you form the rules. I have that worry as well, but what I also worry about is if we don't do anything, then you'll have a lot of competitors just going out of business. They'll either just go out of business entirely because they can't be profitable at all, and you therefore lose that voice, or alternatively, whereas you have a station that, for instance, had its own news department, ran at 10 o'clock news, and they say, I can't do it anymore. I can't afford to do that anymore. I don't have the support for it, and we're just going to have to put on, Seinfeld, or something else.
I think the focus in the industry has changed. Before it was, we need to get bigger to get bigger. And now it is more of a focus on getting smaller. You see CBS selling television stations and radio stations, Clear Channel selling radio stations. So these companies, to Brandon's point, are focused on doing what they do best in their core business. So I think a relaxation of ownership rules won't necessarily create, the scary conglomerates that people were afraid of years ago. I think that business has changed and the focus of the operators has changed to let's do this the best that we can, not just be bigger to be bigger.
Yeah, and if I could just echo that. I know this concern also existed years ago when there was this whole discussion about the ownership cap, that there was a concern, which I gather is outside of this proceeding, but there was a concern that big companies would buy up more and more television stations. Well, in reality, the opposite is happening. The integrated companies tend to be sellers of television stations. NBC's selling, Fox is selling down. They've all sold meaningful amounts of their broadcast groups. The issue, if anything, is the opposite risk. You may find that the big integrated companies are shifting towards cable news as opposed to local news. You may actually find, if you let a marketplace play out among the local news organizations whose DNA is to do local news, be it print, be it television, these people really want to be in the local news business. And I say that as somebody who's not in it, because at least historically, I haven't been able to afford to be in it. The only way I could get in the local news business is to try to piggyback off of someone else's news organization, ask and co-produce a joint product of some sort that is customized for us. Starting up from scratch, going up against all the incumbents as an independent is almost suicidal, obviously. And so you may find that in an odd way, the inverse would happen. You may actually get a more viable source of local news if you let the marketplace play out a little bit.
Yeah, I think if someone uses consolidation as a strategy to eliminate local content, the consumers in that market are going to put them out of business, and that'll take care of itself because there is underlying demand for local content. So I think you hear lots of places where, well, my local newspaper used to have reporting, and now it's all from the AP, and I don't even want it anymore. So I think that's a community by community business decision, but it's not necessarily a ubiquitous threat. And at the same time, the barriers to entry for the creation and distribution of local content have come down significantly with the internet opportunities. So there's alternate sources for that demand to be addressed, which is a healthy thing to have in the market.
To what extent is financing of the larger broadcasters or large market players done through debt, and to what extent through equity? Can you give us a better understanding of that?
Well, there's a lot less debt than there used to be. I think there's, we're in the midst of a complete reorganization. So healthy companies are in the process of deleveraging. So if you still have the cap, but look, if we want a great example, the New York Times company, went to Carlos Slim to raise equity last year. Very, very expensive, preferred equity. There's no bigger name or brand or icon probably globally in news than the New York Times, and they're, basically raising, mezzanine capital just to keep comfort, and doing a sale leaseback on their headquarters in New York. So, I think that story in and of itself highlights how extremely difficult it is. To attract any type of capital. So debt investors have reduced their appetite by about 40%. So back to the house rule, your mortgage is coming due, and you used to have a 80% loan to value, and now the same banker says, well, I'll give you 40%, and you have to come up with the difference. And in many cases, with smaller broadcasters, they're working part-time now because they just don't have the revenue that they used to. And so the only place to fill that is with equity. And equity has been hurt very badly by the bankruptcies and insolvencies. So they're extremely cautious. So, an old business model may have looked like 8 to 10 times debt and two turns of equity. A new business model would be, 3 times debt, and then you have to put in 50% equity, which is very expensive capital, and it's just very hard to get a return. And so what you have is just there's very, very few deals getting done at all outside of restructuring.
And is there a difference in the way that financing works or in the access to capital in smaller versus bigger markets? And I'd like to hear about that.
Smaller markets, by and large, are just harder. And particularly if you're looking at smaller groups that cover a number of markets, so that you have more diversification of cash flow, you can attract better management teams, so it gets easier. Okay, but there was, for years going through the 90s, it was about consolidation. both on the radio and TV side. And the reason for that was as the groups get bigger and more diversified, it becomes increasingly easy as an equity investor or as a lender to get comfortable with the risk and also to try to evaluate what the opportunity is. Also, by consolidating, you then felt that you had the opportunity to exit, whether you were selling to a bigger group or to another, private equity investor or going public. So today, however, you look at those opportunities and they're really non-existent because I don't think there are all that many public, IPO opportunities for the space. I don't know how many private equity funds are terribly interested in the space. The market cap, last time I looked, if you exclude the big diversified companies, it's about $1 billion total market cap for TV and less for radio. So in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty small. So by and large, I would say yes, smaller, harder. Smaller equals harder. Gets a little bit better as you, have a variety of markets within that.
I can tell you there's been interest on the equity side lately. Investors do want to invest in the space, but what they tell me is there's not enough market cap for them to put a lot of money to work. And so they gravitate towards the larger market broadcasters because they tend to have higher cash flow and therefore higher multiples or more multiple expansion and more revenue. And so while there's interest, it's hard to figure out how to get equity investors more, able to put money to work in the smaller markets where the broadcasters are.
Yeah, I would also echo that. In our case, I think it would have been hard to do our restructuring, if we only had sort of the small end of our market group and not the larger market. So I think people in our case got some comfort of having some exposure to the larger markets.
One issue, everyone has basically agreed that the media ownership rules should be relaxed. By the same token, we're talking about firms selling off, and we've seen a lot of consolidations or mergers fail. And so my question, and in fact, some of the public interest groups have alleged that part of the problem is too much consolidation and debt leveraging, and I'd like you to speak about that.
I think it goes to the point I was saying earlier that, for a while there were companies that were getting bigger to get bigger, and they were fighting each other for market share instead of trying to figure out, new business models to attract a larger audience and more revenue and more growth. But I think given what's happened cyclically and also the fact that we've seen such, huge revenue declines, these companies are taking a step back and saying, okay, we realized bigger clearly was not better. So now what do we do to get ourselves out of this hole and to generate more pricing power? And is there a way, to work with the regulator so that we can consolidate in a way that's more friendly to ourselves financially and to the entire market?
Yeah, my question is a follow-up to that. You described that there's a new sensibility in the marketplace. I wasn't here then, but I presume that when the ownership rules were relaxed in the first place, companies were not coming here and saying we want to get big for the sake of getting bigger. They had business rationales for why they thought that made sense. Why are you confident that if ownership rules were relaxed, that wouldn't happen again? Maybe not right now, because of the particular climate and the particular players making their identifications, but why wouldn't it eventually ultimately lead to further consolidation and higher debt levels?
I don't think equity investors would let it. I think that, the equity investor has a different perspective where they're not necessarily awarding consolidation anymore. I mean, we just saw, potentially a merger with Comcast and NBCU. And when the details were leaked, the investors who were long-term holders of Comcast were bailing out of the stock, saying, what, bigger is not better, we don't need this, and really the Roberts family has to prove to us that a merger like this is going to work. And so we consistently hear that. Now the stock has somewhat recovered, but still the investment community is saying, Brian Roberts and Comcast, you must prove to us that consolidation is going to work for the market and the people, because if it does, then you see higher audience, you see higher ratings, you see higher revenue, and therefore, higher cash flow and higher equity.
Related to that, I mean, one of the points of easing the ownership rules would be to allow more consolidation, right? So it's not that would be a mystery, that would be one of the end results.
But consolidation for the sake of consolidation is not a public policy objective. So I think the question, nor is whether or not debt investors overextended themselves and are paying the price. Those are completely separate issues. So was there too much leverage? Yeah, there's no question about that. We look at the bankruptcies and the losses. So, but that the question I think the commission needs to think about is when there was consolidation, was the voices reduced? Was there a constriction of information? Was there a monopolization of voices? And I think what we've seen is that the answer to that is no. And in fact, there's been a abundance of new voices emerging through all different channels during that same period. So I think also the concept of relaxing the ownership rules, the cross-ownership rules, in many cases, if the rules are arcane, there should maybe be a new rule to achieve a new objective, but I wouldn't be wed, to tinkering with an old rule. Look forward, not backward.
I want to just get a sense of kind of scale and perspective. All of you have said that some kind of change, relaxation, or new way of thinking would be an improvement, would make it more likely that that capital could flow in good directions. All of you have also said that aside, there are these seismic shifts in the market that are very important. Can you give us a sense of the relative importance of these two different factors? So if you had these ownership rules changed in the ways that you would like, would that fundamentally change the way you view these businesses and the way that these businesses are succeeding or not succeeding, or do you view it as a minor factor?
It's more than minor. I think it's more than minor. I think it would be a shot of adrenaline to the industry. And in some cases, if you were able to put two broadcasters together that you couldn't previously, that'll be a big plus. So in our business, we then look at a consolidated income statement, and you say, okay, well, there'd be these cost savings over here and these revenue enhancements over there, and that'd be a big plus. Then to get to the next point, to get to the 5-year down the road point, once you realize those improvements, which are, many of them are one-time improvements, but then others are longer ranging. Can you then make some new programming? Can you put back that news program? Can you do these other things? Can you go out into the marketplace when you're selling local programming in a more effective manner, and those kinds of things? Can you better compete against the internet, and these other forms of advertising-based businesses that didn't previously exist? So I think it's definitely more than minor. But then I also don't want to diminish some of these other things that the industry has to do, in terms of getting out there on a digital platform, figure out how to adapt yourself to these new technologies, so that you can be right there, with the other guys as you're competing with it. So, to me, it's it's really both of those things.
I would say it's an important factor. It's not the only factor. You can look at the industry and say there have been, a lot of negatives that have nothing to do with the regulation. You have, a lack of corporate governance across all of media, I think, which has been an issue. I think there's been a lack of price integrity in certain, circumstances, which is an issue that needs to change. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with the regulatory environment. This is more of a, self-inflicted issues that these industries need to focus on in order to also help bail themselves out of what's going on.
I'd make another comment. I think you heard me say that I'm not here to, at least for our company, directly lobby for ownership rule change for the sake of change. I'm lobbying for it indirectly, perhaps hearing my fellow panelists as a source of capital, not having confidence in my industry. That's a bad thing when you're in my seat. So once again, I think opening up the marketplace is I think important, so these ladies and gentlemen can get confidence back to invest in a sector. My issue is in some sense broader than this. My issue is the lopsided nature of the regulation. And it may be a function of, we're here to describe a certain canvas, and that's the box we're in. The real issue is that it's, from my perspective, and I'll say it again, we have no particular integration goal in our company. We're just basically just trying to be an independent to try to get some market share. But what's absurd about the landscape we're in is that it is apparently permissible to own virtually the entire cable system in a market, or the entire satellite system in a market, and 2 television stations, but it is not permissible, especially in a smaller market, to have some level of cross-ownership between radio and print. That just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that you have a country where 70% of search is controlled by one entity, and we can't figure out a way to optimize traditional media. That's where it's lopsided, and that's really the issue. So I think trying to step back and take a macro view on regulation is, I think, going to be an important aspect for the Commission, irrespective of whether it's part of this narrow rulemaking or not. That's really the issue from my perspective.
Perhaps we should give folks a second to wrap up if you have any closing remarks you'd like to offer before we take a break between panels.
I'll make that my closing remark.
Okay.
I'm
Mr.
fine.
Cotter?
I'm as well. I just want to thank you for having me, and it was really enjoyable. I enjoyed my co-panelists as well. A lot of good points.
I would say the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been very stimulating. It will be helpful to us as we continue to analyze these issues in formulating an NOI for the proceeding, which we will hope to do as early this year as we can. And again, I appreciate all of you being here. We'll now take a short 10-minute or 15-minute break and proceed with our second panel. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I think we'll start our second panel of the day now. As we promised, we now have a second panel of distinguished experts in the industry to focus on the financial issues facing smaller broadcasters and those broadcasters who are operating in the smaller markets, and including, in particular, the financial situation facing minority broadcasters. And we're very happy to begin the discussion with Terry Jones. I'll just say that we've invited each of the speakers again to sort of speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll proceed into the questioning. Terry Jones is the Managing General Partner of Syncom Funds. Syncom is a venture capital fund that provides private equity and mid-stage venture financing to minority entrepreneurs, media entities serving underserved groups, and other media entities, small and large. Mr. Jones, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Lake. It's good to be here with you today. I really have not prepared remarks in terms of things that it's sort of not my style. I think that I'm sort of here to represent a person who's been around this industry for the last 30, since 78. How long is that? 31 years, 32 years. Investing in communications properties and media properties. Syncom was started in 1977, fundamentally as a way of providing traditional venture capital to underserved entrepreneurs and markets, and that's sort of defined in various ways to either ethnic minorities, black or Latino, et cetera, or maybe other people who are underserved, which could be older Americans or women or Asians or whatever. And we've sort of, as a policy at our firm, used the concept broadly to really mean underserved, because we really believe that the purpose of the Federal Communications Commission is to serve the public interest, and we've taken that quite seriously, and we think that by providing and focusing on the niche of the underserved, what not only was good public policy, but we were able to create significant wealth because of capital inefficiencies and flows in it, capital flows that weren't going to deserving entrepreneurs and deserving markets. And so over the years, we were able to invest in our first fund, and sort of the history of our investment in our funds sort of, I think, describes what's happened or what's happening today. Because our first fund, as we started in 1977, invested largely in radio stations. We had less than $2 million. And our mission, Herb Wilkins and I, our mission was our mandate was to change the face of ownership in America of media, of radio and television. And then in a few years, we really got it, but next year we got into cable. And with less than $2 million, that was a pretty tough thing to do. We invested in that first fund, and we were able to leverage it using some SBA financing in terms of creating a small business investment company. Ultimately, we were able to create out of that initial fund about 100 investments. We generated over $140 million in gains on that initial capital. Because, in part, not because we were so smart, but because we were in an industry that was really growing and had incredible inefficiencies that we were able to take advantage of. Some of the companies we invested in included Radio One, BET, a lot of the cable companies in this country that were being franchised, and because black and Latino neighborhoods we were able to get franchises and help entrepreneurs get franchises in those markets. We were able to make substantial profits and gains in cities like Newark and Washington, D.C., and Chicago and Albuquerque and Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. We did a lot of those deals, as I said, over 100. The success of that fund allowed us to raise in 1990 a traditional private equity fund, a limited partnership, because that was a corporate structure we had then, and we were able to reinvest the profits. And we had incredible overnight successes like Radio One, which took, in reality, 19 years before we were able to put our money in and then take it public. And I'm being facetious about overnight success because that's really what it took. And it took that because we were so capital constrained and so little capital flowed to this area of the market that we had to piece together deals over a number of years. We didn't have the massive capital that other investment companies, venture companies had to take advantage of opportunities. We had to use our human capital, and I think we did a decent job of that. But that fund created good wealth, good ownership of properties by blacks, Latinos, women, Asians, older Americans. We had a station in Las Vegas, for example, where we financed a format that was serving people over 55, an underserved community, which went from bankruptcy when we bought it to #1. So we really believe in this idea of underserved and public interest, which I'm concerned about today because the talk about consolidation, the talk about relaxation of rules, it seems to me is ignoring that discussion to some extent. And I think that's an important aspect of what this commission is here to do, is still to serve the public interest, the convenience and necessity, which was mandated in 1934. And I haven't heard much of that talked about today. Otherwise, the term public airways is really just lip service. If you're going to just serve a private interest, and so that's an issue. But the second fund we created did do a lot of cable, because from FM radio we went to cable, and cable was growing, so we were again able to be very successful. We were lucky we had money at the right time. We ran out of it at the right time. And then we were able to invest into the changing of the rules, which allowed consolidation, which again we looked at as a way of not fighting rules but using rules to increase ownership by underserved people. So a company like Radio One, instead of opposing the change in the rules for multiple ownership, we said that those rules are written for us. We're going to go own a lot of properties. And we were able to do that by piecing together things. But after that fund, our third and fourth fund, the transition happened. We weren't able to find, because of consolidation, investments in radio and television and cable that we could afford, because not only did the ownership, rules change that allowed multiple ownership, but also how you got franchises and how you were able to get spectrum changed. You were awarded spectrum based on what you could pay. Auctions happened, and they still happen. And of course, auctions result in the guys who were given the free licenses and were able to create wealth in the early days, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. They have the money now to bid and own spectrum, and so cellular and other spectrum is really being sold. The public interest is being sold to the highest bidder. And again, the question is that really in the public interest? So, and just to complete the process, our fifth fund, which is what we're investing in now, we were able to raise our fifth fund, which is a $275 million fund. So we've come a long ways from the less than $2 million fund. We haven't invested in any radio or television or traditional or cable, because it's not, as you heard earlier, a growth industry. It's not an industry that provides a venture return. And so what are we investing in? We're investing in, quote, new media companies, and new media spans a lot of definitions, I suppose. Google's a new media company, for example, or as is Yahoo or whatever. Those are new media companies. It's, to me, the concern that I have about the ownership rules, and the reason I guess I come down on the side of not believing that the change in the rules will necessarily affect the salvation of the industry, which needs to be, saved. But it is what it is. The market forces will determine it. Is that I'm not sure that changing these rules really makes that much of a difference. Perhaps on the margin it does, but I'm not sure that changing it. What it does do is, though, it allows those who have resources and who have gotten those resources free from this commission over the last 80 years to be able to buy up what is really important, and that is spectrum. It's all about spectrum. Whether it's saving the television industry may or may not happen, because the television industry, the way people view video, is going to change. But the question is, who will own that spectrum? And when that spectrum is repurposed, and it will be repurposed at some point, who will be the beneficiaries financially of that? Those of us who are a part of either Black or Latino communities, those of us who are women or Asians or others who have been traditionally discriminated against for the last 80 years, so that the 99% of the control of communications was done on a affirmative action basis for whites. Those 1%, less than 1% of the people who were kept out of that for those years are going to be kept out of and not allowed to own spectrum in the future unless something is done to address that ownership interest. And that's really where wealth will be created, is in the ownership of the spectrum. So with regard to the rules, I guess my position is that I think I'm not convinced that changing them will really make much of a difference in many ways. So in the margins, they may. I would look more towards getting the commission reassessing the public interest and the convenience and necessities, which you really should be doing, as opposed to considering whether or not you should save or help an industry that is being attacked because of natural, technological, and other kinds of business issues, and determine how, in the future, diverse voices can be a part of this industry by having programs and policies that foster, and this is perhaps for another detailed proposals for another conference or another forum. How can these people participate in it, and is that in the public interest? So I'll end there and hopefully be able to answer questions that anyone may have that relates to the experience that we've had over 30 years of investing in these properties. When I didn't mention things like satellites, which we've also been invested in terms of Iridium and other satellite companies. So thank you for the time and for allowing me to sort of ramble here and give you my opinion of what this really should be about.
Thank you very much. I know we'll have a number of questions that are stimulated by your remarks. We'll hear next from Brian McNeil, who is the Managing General Partner of Alta Communications, which is a Boston-based private equity firm that focuses on the media and telecommunications industries, including radio and television. Mr. McNeil.
Thank you, Bill. Like Terry, our firm has been involved in financing radio and TV for 3 decades. Alta Communications and its predecessor company, which was Burry Gendeliage, have been doing it since 1978 as well. We've, over those 30 years, been involved with dozens and dozens of radio companies and stations, some large companies like Radio 1 with Terry and Telemundo, which is now part of NBC, and New City Communications, which is now part of Cox Radio, and small local broadcasters, good small local broadcasters in places like Montgomery, Alabama, Erie, Pennsylvania, Abilene, Texas, standalone properties. So we've seen and been experienced with both large market and small market companies. And in 30 years in the business, we've seen up markets and down markets, and we've lived through, high inflation and high interest rates in the early 80s. We worked through the HLT crisis and the recession of 90, 91, 92, and then the mini recession after the tech crash in 2001, 2002. This recession is different. This recession is much more difficult economically, much more difficult in terms of advertising revenue, and much more difficult working through things in the financial sector. And I take a step back and look at radio and TV there's good news and bad news. And the good news is that radio and TV still have tremendous reach, reaching 95% of the population during the week. They're free. They're local. They are efficient use of the spectrum, unlike some of the broadband and smartphone technologies, which are not efficient use of the spectrum. And they're profitable. They're sustainable and can profitably sustain their operations and do good for the community. The bad news is the industry is in an incredible difficult position from a balance sheet position. If you take a step back and look at the whole industry, or you go into different companies, and this is both for big public companies, medium-sized companies, and small companies. The industry is so over leveraged, it's technically insolvent. Anytime it's operating, it's profitable, it's paying most of its debt service, but you have a business where leverage, and again, it's no one's fault but the industry's own, but leverage got up to 5, 6, 7, 8 times, 9 times cash flow, and then you have a situation where you have cyclical and secular changes in the business over the past 5 years. The secular changes over the past 5 years, and really gradually over the past 25 years, as important as radio and TV still are, and as important as the reach they have, they've been getting fragmented by a long time by other technologies and other medium. So there's a secular change that's gone on in the business that's not going to reverse itself. It's not going to bounce right back. Having said that, they're still viable businesses. But then you layer on top of that the worst recession since the Great Depression, and when you have a business that's leveraged to start, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and you have a situation where because of the economy, revenue's down 20 to 25%. It's largely a fixed cost business. So with revenue down 25%, cash flow, profit could easily be down 40 to 50%. And multiples, the multiples people attach to these are down from unsustainable levels to kind of 5, 6, 7 times cash flow. So you have an industry where the leverage has gone up to, with the drop in cash flow, the leverage has gone to 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And the value of these properties are, depending on who you believe, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 times. So you have an industry that is fighting its way to staying viable, trying to pay down debt, but it's very difficult. So technically, the business is insolvent. 90% of the companies out there are either on the cusp of default, or in workout, or unfortunately, even some big companies like Citadel in bankruptcy. So again, it's the good news, bad news. It's still a very efficient, very effective medium that's profitable. It does great service for the communities and provides good value for millions and millions of listeners. But it's in a very dire financial situation right now. I do believe, again, I don't think there's any one silver bullet, regulatory-wise or otherwise, that can fix the problem. But I do think there's a bunch of issues that individually could help the broadcasters fight their way into a better financial situation, help them pay down their debt and get into a better situation. And there's kind of, as I see it, 2 on the radio side and 2 on the TV side that are regulatory issues that I think could help local broadcast radio and TV. On the radio side, one of the big issues is the music royalty fees, and I think it's important that the commission, number one, understand what a relatively dire financial situation the industry is in right now, and then understand that if in fact the legislation that is before Congress, which would potentially substantially increase music performance royalty fees at a time like this, it could be very damaging to the radio industry. And the second notion that's being thrown around that I think could be very positive for the radio industry is the notion of having FM chips in cell phones. I think it would number one, increase the portability and listenership of local radio, and improve the cachet of local radio, because part of radio's problem is image. It's not considered cool anymore with all the new opportunities, and I think that would really help its business. And at the same time, it's from a policy perspective, it's probably the most efficient way to provide emergency notification for the public, and a lot more efficient than what I understand is the other alternative, which is through texting. I mean, there's a whole lot of people, including myself, that don't text, don't understand texting. So, and the other big issue for radio is, what's my other issue? Sorry about that. Unlike Terry, I didn't prepare my speech, and obviously I should have. I'm sorry. So the two issues in radio were the music royalty issue and cell phones in radio chips and cell phone. On the TV industry, the two issues that I think are really critical if we're going to continue to have free, over-the-air, profitable, sustainable TV are number one, having a dual revenue stream for local broadcasters so they can compete effectively with cable and other content providers, and the second issue. And the second issue is just is to encourage a more deregulated world for local TV. I think that it just doesn't make sense, and they touched upon it in the panel this morning. Given the proliferation of media outlets and voices in the community, to have cross ownership and pretty limiting duopoly regulation still in place doesn't seem to make sense to me. I think it makes sense in terms of creating fundamentally stronger businesses with stronger cash flows and the ability to improve the financial situation, to allow more combinations of local TV stations in market duopoly, and to support and allow logical cross ownership, whether it's radio and print, TV and print, radio, TV, print, because I think the rules against that no longer make sense with the proliferation of voices in a market, and then the other issue I think is a little bit more complicated. It's how to encourage an environment and a partnership where local TV stations will be able to get a second revenue stream. I mean, it's complicated because there are 3 or 4 people in that equation. There's the local TV station, there's the network, and there's the cable company or the wireless company, the telecom company. But it seems to me that there should be a compromise win-win where the local TV station gets a fair monthly revenue per subscriber, which it doesn't get now, to subsidize its advertising-only model, where it'll probably have to do that in partnership with the network, because the network deserves and will want a piece of that, and the broadband or satellite company, I think, should be prepared to pay retransmission fees for good local programming, and in return, I think that broadcasters at some point in time could give up the excess spectrum that they have, because the telecom industry needs more spectrum and the broadcast industry doesn't. And then there are 2 other issues that relate to small market properties in particular. Number one is the notion of local on local and satellite. Right now, in a lot of small markets, the 20-25% of the population that receives its signal through satellite, they don't get local TV stations. They get, in small markets, they'll bring in the ABC affiliate from New York instead of the ABC affiliate in Erie, Pennsylvania, and that just doesn't seem fair to have 20% of the population that's not getting a local signal, so that the satellite or cable provider can carry the 10th station in Philadelphia rather than the top 3 or 4 stations in a local market like Erie. And then the other issue is, in small markets, I'm of the belief, and this is a little bit controversial, but I'm of the belief that allowing lenders to take a security interest in an FCC license, as well as the other assets of a radio or TV station. I think it would help get some banks comfortable with the industry and provide capital to the industry, and I don't think there's much of a risk of those licenses falling into bad hands. So I think that the consideration of changing the rules that allow broadcasters, that allow lenders, not just to pledge an FCC license, I think would have significant practical benefit to small market broadcasters, and I don't think the cost of downside is really there. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNeil. Next, we're delighted to have Susan Patrick, who is co-owner and managing partner of Patrick Communications. She's also a co-owner of Legend Communications, which has 14 radio stations in Wyoming, Ohio, and Missouri. Welcome.
Thank you. The broadcast industry, as I'm sure we're all aware, both radio and television, have been facing the most difficult times economically over the past few years that they've ever experienced. I've been involved with broadcast transactions as a media broker since 1984 and as a small market radio owner since for the last dozen years. I've seen difficult times where the industry suffered from high interest rates, recession, a lack of capital due to changes in banking regulations regarding HLT transactions, and I've seen capital ebb and flow from both of these industries over the years. I've seen many radio stations struggle in the past to become viable after the FCC allowed them to be dropped into markets where the markets were not economically strong enough to sustain these additional stations. And had it not been for the 1996 Telecom Act, in my opinion, many of these stations would not have survived. I've seen television stations adapt to a new reality where networks no longer paid them compensation and they expected the stations to contribute to the network bottom line. I've also seen television stations, both big and small, take on hundreds of thousands of dollars and in some cases millions of dollars in debt just for the purpose of converting to the digital transition, which originally, of course, was a government mandate. It certainly benefited the consumer in a profound way, but I believe that the financial viability of doing so is still in its infancy for most television stations. I've seen small market television stations strive to be able to continue strong local news operations and community involvement, only to be unable to achieve those results due to economic realities. But in my 25 years in this industry, I've never seen such a rapid decrease in revenues and asset values as we've experienced in the past few years. Television and radio revenues in most markets are down by double digits, and in some cases 20 to 30% or more. Even for smaller market radio, which relies more heavily on local revenues, which were not hit as hard by the recession, decreases in revenues have been nearing 10% over the past few years. The reduction of advertising revenue has impacted all players in radio and television, and it spared no one. Certainly companies that seemingly had acceptable levels of debt just a few years ago are now too often highly levered as cash flow and revenues have decreased. This is true of smaller market broadcasters as well as large market, and it is true of publicly traded companies as well as privately owned broadcasters. But it's important to emphasize that it's not just the debt structure of these companies that has caused them to get into trouble. The devastating decreases in advertising revenue over the past 2 years are largely a result of the economic crisis and not so much what these industries have been doing to cause that. The severe decrease in revenues has been systemic, and we've seen it in all aspects of our economy, and certainly not just broadcasting. They're not due to a lack of interest necessarily in these mediums. They're not due to past consolidation, and they're not related to the company's ownership structure or debt levels. None of these have caused the situation that we're in today. It's also important to remember that many radio and TV companies do carry debt, and that it's a reality of our industry. It's not just the largest companies, but in small markets, most owners have some level of debt. And it's not just the people who expanded and went on buying sprees, as I've heard some people declare the consolidation wave, but it's small market broadcasters and television owners who invested in HD radio and in upgrading their facilities or the transition to digital, and who only own small clusters in a few markets or maybe just one market. They have debt too. And some of these radio and TV companies had 40, 50%, 60% debt levels according to their asset values, which in our industry was considered modest and not highly levered. Yet even these fiscally conservative and responsible owners are struggling today to meet debt service and are having to negotiate with their lenders to survive. So I think it's an unfair assessment to say that the industry's brought this on themselves by taking on too much debt. It's way too simplistic. It's simply not the case for many, many owners. As I've heard one analyst state, even the really great operators did not see this one coming. The vast majority of radio and television owners are locally committed to their communities and strive to provide programming that is relevant and locally focused. However, to compensate for the lack of revenue, radio and TV operators have had to let personnel go and have been forced to cut back on services, just like many other business owners across the United States. I hope and believe that we've hit bottom and that advertising revenues will begin to slowly rebound in 2010. However, I believe the growth will be slow and perhaps fitful. Because many broadcast stations, both publicly owned and private, are struggling economically, are in default with their lenders, and have lost significant fair market value, capital sources have virtually abandoned the radio and TV industries. This has affected small market operators, perhaps more than large market operators, because capital will be slower to return to smaller markets. But it also affects new entrants to our industries, regular entrants, minority entrants, women, you name it. It'll be harder to get capital going forward. As financial prospects improve, we hope that we'll likely to see capital sources begin to consider investing and lending to radio and television again. However, it will be paramount that such financial sources believe that the framework and fundamentals of owning radio and TV are solid and not subject to significant changes in regulations that would materially affect station value and their investment. This holds true for institutional equity, debt, and investors using their own capital. Even if a broadcaster is investing his or her own money, why would they do so if the FCC or Congress is going to take action to the detriment of that investment? Broadcasters must have a stable structure that allows them to operate and serve their communities, yet still be an attractive investment vehicle. Going forward, I would respectfully advise that the FCC consider a review of the economic effects of potential regulation as the most important factor you consider. Your mantra should first and foremost be do no harm. The FCC should also avoid proposing regulation based on its view only of the largest companies in our industries. The majority of stations are not controlled by those owners, and the legislation is often even more severe in its effect on those smaller market broadcasters. In terms of radio, it's my opinion at this time that the FCC should probably do nothing with regard to the ownership regulations. I'd be all for a relaxation. I don't know that it would really help, but I certainly believe that any move to deconsolidate radio from current levels would guarantee that the capital sources will run for the hills. The industry needs to be stable first and foremost, considering its regulated status. With regard to television, and particularly small and medium market television, the industry urgently needs further duopoly ownership relief, similar to that already granted to large market stations. Too many smaller and medium-sized TV stations have cut back or eliminated their news operations because they can't afford them. By allowing two stations to be jointly operated in these small and medium markets, TV operators will have the ability again to increase the viability and effectiveness of their news and better serve their communities. For those who argue that this diminishes voices, I wholeheartedly disagree. With the advent of the internet, cable news channels, blogs, social networking, you name it, the voices are there to be heard. Consumers can get opinions everywhere, on TV, on the radio, on the internet, and on their phone. There are voices just waiting to be heard. I believe the FCC should also grant cross-ownership of broadcast stations and newspapers. I believe that the newspaper industry as we know it is perhaps in its final throes. It's a natural fit to be paired with existing or future television and radio station owners, and it would help both industries and the newspaper industry. The FCC has professed to be fairly concerned about the future of journalism as we know it, and this would go a long way to saving that important part of our political process. It's never been more important to consider the economics of regulation than it is in this time. Do no harm, keep the broadcast regulatory expectations stable, and grant relief that will further the economic viability of existing stations. By doing so, the radio and TV industries can continue their strong histories of localism, community involvement, being significant employers in their markets, being there in emergency situations, and providing free over-the-air broadcasts. Thanks. I also concur with Brian. I think a security interest in licenses would be an excellent move, and there's very little downside because they effectively have security in the license already through various investment vehicles and stock pledges and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Patrick. And now we welcome Rick Peters, who is co-founder of Blue Water Broadcasting, a radio broadcasting company formed to consolidate small market radio stations in the southeastern United States. The company currently operates a 4-station radio cluster in Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome, Mr. Peters.
Thank you. I've been sitting here for the last 40 minutes deciding whether I was going to read these remarks the way I wrote them or just use them as talking points. And I've decided after listening that I'm going to use them as talking points instead. By way of background, I've been in the business for 39 years. I've done everything. I've been a disc jockey. I've been a chief engineer. I was a program director, a consultant. I participated in the first wave of consolidation and rolled up 55 stations into a company called Southern Star, which was a division of Capstar. So I participated in the first round of consolidation. And then I went out and, under the heading of Be Careful What You Wish For, ended up with this cluster in Montgomery, Alabama. 3 FMs and an AM, a translator, and an LMA. So I've seen it from both sides. I've seen it from mainstream America, and I've seen it from the big corporations. And I think it gives me an interesting perspective. The original wave of consolidation, well, my company, the bigger company, rolled up 400 stations in 12 months. Well, what comes with that? We had all these radio stations, and we had no idea how to run them. We had to create consolidation on the fly. Consolidation is not the boogeyman. In fact, I would maintain, and I would make the case that if we didn't have consolidation right now, we would not have a viable industry. Because it's the only way for us to compete against all these new media voices, all these new outlets for information, all these new outlets for entertainment. Consolidation is not a negative. There are negatives, however, associated with consolidation, because the only way to get your hands around these big companies is to centralize control. And centralized control, by its very definition, means less local control. And this industry has been built on localism and local control. So I would say that's the negative to consolidation. And it's having been in the situation and then having been on Main Street running my radio stations, I see the problems. In fact, when we started this company, Blue Water Broadcasting, our kind of mission statement was, let's not do it the way the consolidators do it. Let's try to go back and do it the way we used to do it in the 70s, which was local ownership and mom and pop operations and being in parts of the community. And that's what we've tried to do. So where are we today? I purchased this group in 2004. I've doubled the ratings. I've doubled the revenue, and my company is worth 60% less than it was when I bought it. That's where we are today. And it's a reality. We've been swimming upstream for 5 years. 6 months ago, I had to file Chapter 11 so that I would have the opportunity to negotiate with my debtors so I could operate while I was trying to renegotiate this incredible debt load. Again, this comes under the heading of be careful what you wish for. I thought we had a great operation. The economy tanks. And by the way, I've got a great partner. It's Alta. I've got a great partner. That's not the issue. The issue is the economy. From a revenue standpoint, this is the worst I've seen it in 39 years in broadcasting. Everybody I talk to is down 20, 25%. It's very difficult to work in the public interest when your revenue is so bad. And frankly, I'll get to that in a second. Bank financing, especially in my market, which is market 151, it's virtually non-existent. And if it can be found, it's at onerous rates. This was discussed in the first session. This industry can no longer support 25% internal rates of return. This industry can no longer support 15, 18% interest rates. We're a mature industry, And it's just not sustainable anymore on those levels. So that's the bad news. What's the good news? Because I'm still in the business. I think that there's good news here. The good news is we may be slow, but we're not stupid. We're starting to learn new media. We're starting to understand these new platforms. We're starting to discover new revenue streams. Keep in mind that, at least from my perspective, I live in Montgomery, Alabama. It was not necessarily my intention to live in Montgomery, Alabama. I was going to be the big broadcast company. I was going to live in Fort Lauderdale, but it became obvious to me about 3 years ago, that if I was going to make this company sustain itself, I was going to have to live and breathe and work and participate in that community. And that's what we've done. Everybody in this company is local, and I think that gives us an advantage. I mean, we are a resource in our town. We're a disseminator of information. We're an entertainer. It really is what I'm most proud of. In all these conversations, and Terry, I was glad to hear you say it, I don't hear enough about these three words: public interest, convenience, and necessity. It's very easy to forget those three words for words like internal rate of return, bottom line, return on investment, margin, interest rate. And my concern is that we don't forget why we have these licenses in the first place. And the reason we have these licenses in the first place is to serve in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. So, in my opinion, we don't need help understanding our mission from you all, to be Southern for a second. We don't need more cumbersome paperwork and regulation. We already understand our market. We understand our mission, at least on a local level. I can't speak for Citadel or Clear Channel or Cumulus or any of these big companies, but there are a lot. I don't hold myself up to be extraordinary. There are a lot of great local broadcasters out there that are doing this on a day-to-day basis. And we understand our constituents. We understand that we need to serve our constituents. And I want to say one other thing. I've seen a lot go on here. I've seen Hurricane Andrew. I've went through Katrina, Hurricane Ivan, 9/11, missing children, national emergencies, and on and on. And when the power goes off and the Wi-Fi goes off and the batteries on the computer run dry, and you're left with nothing other than what? Local radio and hopefully local television. We're a very robust medium, and I'm very proud of the fact that we're a robust medium. And I think we are at our best when the chips are down. I think we're at our best. I look at the Clear Channel stations in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina happened. It was an exemplary piece of public broadcasting. Didn't matter about the revenue. It didn't matter about the formats. It mattered about nothing other than getting this community through a very dire situation. I'm proud of that. Am I getting across that I really like this business? Was consolidation a bad thing? No. Without it, we wouldn't be here. I really believe that. If I had to run these stations individually, it would not be a viable business. I do believe that we have too much talk of margins and accountants, and I think we'd be best served if we could somehow get the broadcasters more involved in broadcasting again. We're way too focused on the business of the business, and we're not focused enough on our mandate, which is serving the community. Now, that might make me kind of an outsider. I do know this. We don't need more outside industries trying to pick our pockets. And I'm tired of being considered a fat cat. I'd be glad to show you my spreadsheets. I guarantee you nobody's getting rich in my company. But we're hanging in there. And it really irritates me when, for example, the record industry, because their business model is probably sicker than ours, is trying to put their hands in our pocket. My iPod cost me money. My Wi-Fi cost me money. My internet provider cost me money. My phone cost me money. My satellite TV costs me money. My cable costs me money. We are the only free and local broadcast left. We're the only free voice. That's why I'm still in the business. I think it's unique in probably the world. And free and local. We need to keep those in mind. Those 2 words and those 3 words. I believe we're going to come out of this. I may be an optimist. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now, as we did with the first panel, I would just like to invite each of the speakers, if you'd like to make any comments on what you've heard from the other speakers, starting with Mr. Jones.
I think the other speakers spoke very well, very passionately about their experiences, and I think the benefit here is that you are listening to people who have been who are experienced in this industry in a very intimate way for the last several years. So whatever they're saying, whether you agree with it or not, it comes from experience, not from theoretics on this panel, from what I can tell. And I think that's really the value of this panel, and that's my comment.
Yeah, I'd really echo what Rick said. I mean, there's a lot of really good broadcasters who, again, have to spend a significant amount of their time being business people and financial people, but they're really good broadcasters that really do care about local and free broadcasting. And again, I don't think there's any one silver bullet, but there's a handful of issues that I think could really help local radio, local TV stations, and the policy cost or the downside, I just don't see. So I think this is a really critical time for the industry because it's technically insolvent. So I think you do need some help.
I think everyone's been well spoken here. I certainly concur with Rick. Our stations in Wyoming are in very, very small markets. We have no local television. It comes out of Billings, Montana, in a completely different state. And it's not relevant at all to most of the people in our community. So our radio stations are very, very important. And when we bought them, there was like 5 or 6 stations, and they were 5 or 6 owners, and we were able to consolidate them under the rules of the FCC. And I think we've done a great job fulfilling our public interest, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without consolidation. You know, most of our stations, when we bought them, had no local news. They had no community service programs, and because we were able to consolidate into one building and one administrative function, we were able to provide much more local content than they had ever done before. So I agree. I don't think consolidation is the problem, but small market broadcasters are really struggling to continue that type of service. You know, we had very little debt, but even we're having to negotiate with our lender at this point because, you know, we're making our debt service, but our covenants are not quite where they should be, and we're certainly suffering from a real lack in the value of our equity, which makes most lenders nervous. So, you know, we need relief, and hopefully we can get it.
I don't see any reason why the commission shouldn't move to change the rules about cross-ownership with newspapers and radio and television. And the reason I say that is, and I'll say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, it would be kind of like lashing the Lusitania to the Titanic. Why are you concerned? We have so many other voices out there that it does not stifle the free exchange of ideas anymore. Maybe it did in the 60s. Maybe it did in the 70s. It certainly doesn't now. So I just don't see the logic to it. That's all I can say about that.
Thank you very much. Jennifer Tatel of the Media Bureau will lead off the questioning.
I'd like to just pick up right where you left off. Lots of talk about consolidation and maybe some surprise that there isn't a little bit more opposition towards consolidation from small market representatives who I think traditional thought is that tend to be more harmed by consolidation. If we were to see a relaxation of the media ownership rules, do you think you'd see a lot of consolidation? Would it disproportionately impact the markets that we're talking about, smaller markets? How would that impact the financing options in those smaller markets?
Go ahead.
You know, honestly, I don't know that we would see tons of consolidation, and it would depend on what the scope of the regulations allowed. the large markets are largely consolidated. There isn't much to go there unless you start putting groups together in those markets, and I don't know that the capital structure of the industry right now accommodates that. Maybe that would draw capital to the industry. But with regard to smaller markets, people who own in smaller markets don't play in larger markets. And I don't know very many smaller market broadcasters that have felt threatened by larger and medium markets and consolidation. It's like it's a different world. We don't operate in those circles. And, I believe that the ownership regulations as they're stated for smaller markets is sufficient. It works. We've certainly benefited our communities, I think. And personally, and based on other people that I know in similar situations, we're not threatened by it at all. But I don't think you'd see a mass, Rick coming to buy me, and I don't see that happening given the current economic climate.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be, even if you changed and deregulated the rules further, it's going to take a little while, and for the industry to pay down debt and for capital markets to want to come back to the business. To get a new loan from a lender these days, the new lending requirements are kind of 3 times debt to cash flow. That's more than double where we are. So it's going to take a while for the industry to work back into the growth mode, even if you did change. So I don't think the rules would affect companies coming and buying. The only difference I do think is in small market television. Small market television, right now the rules, large markets can have strong duopolies, small markets cannot. And there's a lot of small market TV companies that are again technically insolvent. If you did allow duopoly in TV, so that one owner would be able to own 2 stations in a market like they can in the larger markets. Again, I think you'd still have 2 strong voices just in television, in addition to radio and cable and internet and blogging. So I don't think it would affect the voices in the market, and I think it would make a dramatic difference in the ability of local broadcast, small market local broadcast TV to remain viable.
I guess my comment would be that the reason people consolidate is because the consolidation is supposed to be attractive and provide you with new opportunities and profits, et cetera. And to the extent that you're talking about sinking sort of ships, there's not likely to be great consolidation right now. The consolidation happened because people thought there was an upside and growth. And so they won't see much consolidation right now at these prices. But ultimately, if you assume that if you cleared the deck, if you said, okay, this industry is in trouble, it's got this much capital, but it's only worth 20% of that, and all of a sudden the values just dropped there. The banks took their hit, the equity holders took their hit, and these licenses are now purchasable for $100,000 instead of $5 million. Somebody would buy them for $100,000. The industry is not going to go away. What's going to go away, perhaps, are the people who made investments who got sort of like musical chairs. The last guy standing there wasn't a chair for you, so you're going to lose. And so that's going to happen. It's happening. Big guys, the incumbents, say, protect me from that happening in some way. Allow me to do other things or whatever so that I can, not lose the money that I've sort of lost because the technology and other things have made my property less valuable. This industry will be revalued and reconstituted, and it will then again be an attractive consolidation opportunity for people at that point. So the consolidation won't happen now, but it will happen once the values get down and it gets reconstituted. The question is, does this commission want to have that reconstituted industry controlled by a few voices or a lot of voices, or does it really matter? That's the perennial question. That's the question every year, and that's really the question we should be talking about: is ownership and serving the public interest. This notion that these new voices are there, and therefore it's okay for one person. Really, let's take it to the ultimate extreme: one company to own everything. Of the airwaves is okay because that's the logical extension of it's okay that there's these new voices and nobody's heard. Well, of course, there are new voices, but are those new voices able to speak and be heard, really? There are millions of internet sites, so you can say the internet provides the opportunity for new voices. You and I don't know them. I mean, I don't even know how many apps there are on the doggone iPhone. There's hundreds of thousands. So what? I'm only going to listen to 4 or 5 of them, and the 4 or 5 are the people who have been given the opportunity to control the airways, to get spectrum free over the years, and now have the assets and resources to control those assets and keep other people out. They will not necessarily serve the public interest. You can bring a panel of people here, practitioners here, who can testify for you that, in fact, these big entities do not serve necessarily. Sometimes they do necessarily serve the public interest. Your job is to continue to make that decision. It's not. You can't look to us necessarily for that answer. You get information, and you decide what your job is and how to protect that interest. And you know, like you said, business is one issue, public interest is another. Your job is to reconcile those two, and it's tough.
There's a third issue, or a third component, and that is I would hate to see a business in my industry, radio, where there wasn't competition, because the competition makes us all better. I'm in a market where I have number 1 and number 2, Clear Channel and Cumulus, and me. I relish my role as the spoiler. And I would hate to see an industry where I, as an idea or concept, didn't exist. So on one hand, I don't think we should ever get to the point where one voice, one consolidator can own everything. I'm much more concerned about fair and honest competition in an industry that is consolidated enough that we can survive. So I guess your role is, with our input, to try to help figure out what that is. I don't have a problem with Clear Channel being in all these markets. I have a problem with Clear Channel owning every station in a market. That's my problem. And it's frankly, it's 2 different conversation points.
So consolidation isn't bad,
no,
but up to a point.
Up to a point. Well, pizza's good up to a point. But
So that argues not in favor of a total relaxation or an elimination of the rules, even though what we expect is not consolidation right away. That argues in favor of some relaxation, but not completely.
Our financial problems are not based on the fact that we haven't been able to consolidate enough, or that we're being restricted from consolidation. That's not our problem. In fact, I could make the case, and I think you alluded to this just a few moments ago, that some of these big consolidators are more concerned with their bottom line than the public interest. And I know that's a very unpopular sentiment in my business to sit here and speak, but I believe it to be the truth. Ask some of these big companies how many news people they have. Ask how much public service programming they do. I'm concerned on that level. By the same respect, I'm also concerned about the fact that the Commission floats ideas like community relations boards to tell me what I should be doing with my radio company. I really don't need your help.
Just to focus really on the media ownership limitations that we have in place, you guys have mentioned a lot of different rules that are impacting your industry that you think we should consider, not consider. But just to focus on the rules themselves, how much of a change or a relaxation of the rules would impact your ability to get financing, for example, if small market duopolies were allowed? How would that impact?
Again, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not gonna change the fact that a lot of these companies are leveraged at 6-7 times now because the cash flow has gone down, and even when they hit a default or when the loan matures, to talk to that same bank, the bank wants to lend at 3 times cash flow. So you're not gonna fix that problem, but every little bit helps. So to the extent that you allowed 2 small market TV stations to consolidate like they can in the large markets. And again, I think there'll still be plenty of voices to be heard. I think the public interest will be served because, quite frankly, in the duopolies that I've seen or been involved in, they have greater ability to do local news than two separate owners, both of whom are over leveraged and cutting back every place. So I think the public interest is served, and I think what happens is that when you combine two local market TV stations, there's some amount of G&A that can be eliminated, and there's some amount of revenue that can be increased, usually by cross-purposing news. And if that would allow the combined entities to increase their cash flow by 10%, that would help get them to where they need to go, which is the ability to service and pay down their debt. So again, by itself, it's not going to fix the problem. But will it help small market TV broadcasters? Yeah, it'll help them. It'll help them a lot over the next 5 years. Not immediately, but over 5 years, it'll help them a lot.
The issue with small market television was a concern way before the current recession. There were small market television stations that had already stopped doing news or had severely cut it back before we saw the decrease in revenue. So it's been a long-term problem for small market television broadcasters. And I agree with Brian, it won't help immediately, but there are economic efficiencies. That is the reality of consolidation, and that will help, and eventually that will draw capital. And I would think that there might be current equity holders that, even though some of these stations are technically underwater, this would be a viable investment to make, because in the long run it will improve the value of both asset bases. So I do think it would help, but please note, this is a problem that is not related directly to the recession as it is today. It's been an ongoing problem.
We've heard a lot about the horrific lending market that broadcasters are facing. Does it disproportionately impact minority and female-owned broadcasters?
Yes, but minority and female broadcasters have always been at some disadvantage, and it's not because they're minorities and females. Money is colorblind. It doesn't matter what and I firmly believe that. But in many cases, new entrants that are minorities and women have only the access to capital that enables them to get in at the smaller market level. And just by definition, smaller market broadcasting attracts significantly lower levels of capital. It is very difficult to get an institutional investor to be interested in you at a small market level, and there's very few lenders. There's almost no lenders now. But even in the good times, there were 3 or 4 or 5 lenders who made loans under $10 million. So anyone, whether you're a minority or a woman or green, you couldn't get money in very rare cases. I'm on a task force that's been talking with the FCC about trying to expand access to capital and getting more local banks and things involved, but it's been an uphill battle for the entire 25 years that I've been in this industry. And these things will help, but it's an uphill battle, and it always will be.
I guess I'm expected to speak on this. The reality is the capital flows to places it's comfortable and that it knows, and Brian and we invest in people that we feel comfortable with, and to the extent that capital is controlled by people that don't necessarily look like her or me, they're going to be more comfortable lending to and investing in people that they feel comfortable with. That's just a reality. But on top of that, you've got these structural issues that the FCC over its life has created. I mean, the discrimination that the FCC promoted from 1924 to at least 65 or so, they kept everybody else out of the industry. And then when it did open up to some extent, and during Chairman, I guess who was it? Was Wiley's period to use incentives to change the ownership structure and therefore the wealth creation and the participation. That brief period did have an effect, and so if you're really talking about ownership and the diversity of ownership and wealth creation and views, you have to go back to create incentives and believe that that's important for in the national interest to do it. That the Republican administrations that came in after that decided that it wasn't important. And you're not going to change it with ownership, with media rules or whatever. It's going to have to be based on economic incentives that drive this country and this economy being put in place. And to the extent that the Commission wants to discuss that and talk about it in a serious way, there are numerous parties that have ideas that have been put forth over the last several years that have been ignored to address that. And primarily we're talking about some sort of incentives for the capital to flow. So yeah, they've been hurt more. Minorities have been hurt more. Blacks, I don't like the word minorities, quite frankly. I think it's a demeaning term, but that's a personal issue. But people of because in fact, as this country demographically has shifted, we talked this morning about the shifts in consumption, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reality is the shift is demographic as well, and it's racial as well in this country, so that the word minority really doesn't apply to the listening audience the way it did 10 years ago, and it certainly won't apply that way in the future. So again, you know, it's very clear that the Commission has a difficult job, but it has to decide what's in the public interest. If it's in the public interest for capital to flow into hands that can own spectrum and use that spectrum efficiently and creatively, then it should create those initiatives. Right now, the Commission, over the last several years, it seems to me, has created policies and procedures where capital will not flow to those diverse groups because incumbents are being given, and even proposals that I heard primarily this morning are designed to salvage the incumbent's position in this industry as opposed to creating opportunities for new entrants that would perhaps serve the public better. So that's a continuation of what's been happening over the last several years.
It's not as simple as just creating opportunity either. Equity and debt go to who at least they judge to be the most experienced candidate. So you have to have a whole system in broadcasting that rewards and promotes minorities and women and that they can get to the upper echelon. I mean, I don't blame people like Brian who want to invest with the most experienced operator out there, but the reality is that's probably going to be a white guy who's been in the system and who's worked at radio and television and has been in management. And unless you get, you know, and it's better than it used to be, no doubt, but until you have minorities and women who are at the top levels of management, you're not going to see, money flowing to those individuals until they believe that they have the experience, very frankly.
Ms. Patrick, you talked about keeping expectations stable as we do this proceeding, and I wonder if you're thinking in terms of process or particular outcomes. And then I have a follow-up to that.
I'm both. The most negative thing you can do in an industry that is suffering from a lack of capital and a lack of investment is to start changing all the rules. Lenders and investors tend to go in for a set time frame. I think many of them are in longer now than they had hoped to be. But there's a window of investment and opportunity for many lenders and many equity investors. And they want to know that when they put the money in and when they bet on an operator or bet on a group of stations, that the framework of how those stations are held and the regulations upon which they base their investment decision are largely going to stay the same. If not get better, they're certainly not going to get worse. And, we don't see that, I think, sometimes from the FCC. And you look at it from a specific point of view, and I'm not faulting this commission, it's brand new, but I think in the past, the commission has sort of had blinders on and doesn't look at the entire picture of an industry. There are times, people buy construction permits, and we pay money for those construction permits based on a certain expectation that we could put those stations and operate them jointly with our other radio stations. And the price we paid the FCC is based on a set of fixed expectations. Then when you propose localism and say that, you're not going to let stations share studio space anymore and they all have to have their own individual, facilities, that totally destroys the model upon which we borrowed and invested our own money. And so, that's me on a very small scale. But when you do that with institutional equity, you're just asking them to say that's a disorganized industry, you can't count on it, it's too highly regulated, the rules are not consistent, I'm not going there.
So are you talking mainly about a tightening of the rules would be disruptive?
I think, yes, a tightening of the rules. Usually, capital does not frown on deregulation.
The second thing you said is you thought a look at economic conditions should be our guiding principle, the economic conditions of the industry. And I wonder, how do we reconcile that in a practical way with our goals of localism, diversity, and competition?
Well, I think right now it's pretty fundamental. We won't have localism and diversity or radio and television stations unless you're careful. I think you have to talk to people. I think you have to look at more than just, Clear Channel's the big, horrible monster, and we have to do what we can to avoid that happening again, because it's not an issue. I mean, it's not an important issue right now. It is, you want to prevent people from dominating markets, but there are more fundamental things that you need to look at in this environment.
I'd like to follow up on something you mentioned, which is shared services. Follow up on shared services, and to what extent are shared service agreements and JSA agreements and things like that an alternative way of achieving efficiencies of scale and scope to help with that? And also, to what extent, how do they impact the public interest, in your view?
I mean, the ones where I have direct experience, where they are ways for broadcasters to share costs, and so because according to the current rules they can't combine, or because the two owners don't want to combine, they want to own and operate them separately, but they are allowed to share services and share the cost of that. I've never seen. I've seen a bunch of them. I've never seen one where anything bad became of it. They had two professional broadcasters sharing costs. I've never, in my experience, it's had a positive economic effect. It's helped both companies do a better job making their debt payments. And again, most of the ones I've seen have not been a cutback in local service, but an increase. I've seen people provide more news resources for a weaker, smaller broadcaster than that broadcaster could have provided on their own. So again, we've only done a handful of them, and again, I think from a lender's perspective or an investor's perspective. They're still kind of a little bit confused by them because they're a little bit more complex than if one company is allowed to own two stations. There's legal complexities, and so there's some banks and sophisticated investors understand them. Less sophisticated investors in some smaller banks don't understand them. So I think that where it makes sense, deregulation and allowing combined ownership is better than shared services. Shared services, the ones that I've seen, absolutely help financially both parties, and the ones I've seen have made both companies better able to serve the public interest. So I've had nothing but good experience with them. I've never seen one that has had a.
No. My experience has been very positive with those two, but it's an alternative that small market and medium market television stations have had to rely on in lieu of being able to own stations directly. I think it is confusing sometimes for investors. It's harder, and lenders, it's harder to grapple with where, if you had to break them apart, who gets what, who gets the benefit, do we go back to having less cash flow equally? It's harder to secure the situation. It would be much cleaner to just be able to own them directly. And And very honestly, going back to stability and the framework, every so often the FCC will say, well, we're going to study JSAs, and we might, we're going to do a rulemaking, and we may get rid of them. That doesn't help, because then you've sort of, put them in a tenuous situation. We know many, many television clients who would benefit greatly from either duopoly or shared services agreements, and they refuse to do them because they're worried that they'll get involved and they'll get tied to another company, and then the FCC will change the rules midstream and they'll be out of luck.
A lot of what you said just raises the question in my mind about the benefit of a bright line rule versus a case-by-case approach. And as we look to revamp our rules, is there a preference among the panelists to some sort of bright line rule with a line somewhere, or a case-by-case, transaction-by-transaction approach?
I have just a couple comments I want to make on rules that might help this industry. And your question of bright line or not is maybe a little too complex for me. I think case by case is the reality, although people need to understand brightly what they can and can't do. So I don't know where you end up there. A couple things. Capital flow. We're talking about saving an industry because capital, or at least trying to support an industry where capital is not flowing. But we're not talking about ways to incentivize capital to flow. And that's obviously to some extent a congressional task, because it often involves tax and other revenue consequences. But the Commission should be talking about ways to incentivize capital to flow. And I don't think it's necessarily going to flow because you're going to change any one of these rules, because it really doesn't address the underlying competitive and technological issues that have made this happen so rapidly over the last 5 or 6 years. But if you really think about using tax policy to incentivize capital to flow, if you think about addressing, and I was talking earlier with Skip Finley, who shares this view, of addressing the foreign ownership rules, which could allow capital to flow from outside this country into this industry, and there may be a significant interest by capital providers outside this country of doing that. I'll give you a quick example. We started and funded a Spanish-language television network a couple of years ago called VEME, CME. And what we did was, we think, an innovative approach by affiliating public television stations as the distributors of the programming. And we did that because the public stations have a must-carry deal with NCTA. So the way to get around the ability to get your programming distributed, which, by the way, is another subject, because because a few feudal barons in the cable industry control what we see and can see, and that's been allowed to. The FCC allowed that to happen. 5 guys basically control what you and my children can and ever will see. And in order to get on those cable systems, you have to give up equity, and that's just a reality. And I know it's against your laws, but that's what happens when you go negotiate with these guys. If you're talking to Direct or I shouldn't mention the name, it's the satellite guys or the cable guys. You don't get your channel on their system, and unless you do a deal that they want to get equity for. So you don't get on. So all this, again, this talk about diversity of voices, it's got to be tempered with what's really out there. So anyhow, we did a deal with the public broadcasting stations, which have a must-carry rule. They say, okay, we'll use one of your digital channels, and all of a sudden we can create a distribution platform of 40, 50, 60, now with the digital conversion, 80 million homes almost overnight in terms of distribution. Now, the problem there is that you've got rules that prohibit the public stations to be able to compete in terms of advertising with commercial stations, some for good reason. But I believe a look at those rules and the ability of the public broadcasting owners to partner with private owners could, in fact, serve to, one, provide capital to the industry, and two, also provide local content and programming, because those public owners really are very locally focused and provide tremendous service. And this service that we created, we believe, provides very high quality Spanish language television, which doesn't exist, in my opinion, in this country otherwise in the larger commercial, educational, and other kinds of quality programming. So that, and it, looking at the public rules, the public broadcasting rules, and allowing them to perhaps compete better in terms of their advertising, et cetera, will be helpful. And looking at the ability to attract capital from abroad into the broadcasting industry. We just did a deal with one of the largest broadcasters in the largest broadcasting media conglomerate in Spain to invest in that company. And they're very interested in this market. Now they will come at a different cost and price potentially than American strategic partners, because they get access to a new market, and we should incentivize and I believe that kind of investment from abroad that right now is being inhibited by the current rules.
Anyone else want to comment on bright line rules versus a case-by-case approach when you're talking about media ownership limitations and consolidation?
The only thing about case-by-case, which is maybe where you end up practically, is it's hard to plan around case-by-case. It's hard to attract capital case-by-case. So, but again, maybe that's where you end up. But to me, there's certain rules which, when you really think about it, may have made a lot of sense when they were initially instituted, and may not make sense now, may not be adding any value, but do. I mean, something is like some of the attribution rules, and I'm not even 100% sure what they are anymore, but I've always been a little bit confused by one of the attribution rules used to be if you have a single board seat and or if you own more than 5% of a company. I'm not sure if that's the right percentage, but I'm not sure how that allows you to control anything. I've had a single board seat in a whole bunch of companies, and it doesn't allow you to do anything. So I think there are some things that are antiquated that restrict capital. I mean, if there's an investor, there is an investor who a private equity hedge fund who is a very small investor in Clear Channel now, but he has a board seat, and we've approached him to co-invest with us in a number of other broadcast deals, and he can't because he has a single board seat in the. I don't even know how big the Clear Channel board is. It's probably 13 people, and he's a really small investor. By himself, he has no control or influence over what goes on there. But he can't invest in any of these other small broadcast properties because he's considered attributable because of his one board seat in a 2% ownership position in Clear Channel. So anyway, I think there's certain areas like small market TV cross ownership where bright line policy would really help the industry. I think because if you're talking about creating capital and making an industry better, and the people can plan around it.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. A few of you cited examples where consolidation led to improved local news functions. And then others made reference to situations where consolidation went in the other direction, where it led to less effective local coverage or service of the community. So what distinguishes these two scenarios? What are the characteristics that determine when consolidation or these sorts of arrangements lead to less local programming and coverage, and when they lead to more or better local coverage?
That's tough. You know, my guess is that Cumulus and Citadel and Clear Channel would disagree when we say that their consolidation has led to less community service, and perhaps their general managers at the local level would also disagree. You know, my experience has been that in smaller markets, you know, when you have fewer stations, it's easier to handle them and get a grip on them, and it's just the reality. When you have a very, very large company that owns across many, many markets, the tendency is to try to find the economic benefit and to centralize operations. And I think Rick said that when you centralize operations, you do tend to perhaps have less local involvement and flavor. But that being said, I think that there are many big market stations that are owned by major group owners that are local. Look at WTOP. I mean, they're owned by one of the biggest broadcasters there is, and they're very local, and they serve their community well. So I think it's hard to make a blanket statement. But in trends, the more stations you have, the harder it is to manage them on an individual basis, and you do have some risk there that you're going to suffer from a lack of localism.
I'm not sure it's a consolidation issue. I would go back to kind of without sounding like a broken record, the more you concentrate on absolutely maximizing every single cent you can drive to the bottom line, the more likely you are to not pay attention to the public interest, convenience, and necessity. This is one of the few industries, in fact, I've been scratching my head here trying to figure out who else I could use, where we really do have this tug of war between maybe we don't need to make quite as much money because we really have another higher obligation, and that is to these tenants that, you know, I haven't heard those words said in 30 years until you said them. And I actually wrote them in here because I said, you know, we've forgotten this to a great extent in many places. It really isn't a matter of consolidation. It's a matter of pressure. Some of the pressure is brought on by the financial situation where it's really easy to fire a news guy. It's really easy to fire a disc jockey. Almost nobody fires salespeople. Really, it's a matter of our financial condition more than anything else that is affecting our ability. And I'm happy. I've got the only local news team in Montgomery, Alabama, on radio. All the other broadcasters are using TV station news departments. And there's nothing wrong with that. I use them too. I use the TV news department to fill in where I can't have my local news people. But I'm the only local radio news department in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yeah, when you have consolidation, now, if you're referring to as consolidation strictly being cost cutting, it's only one part of consolidation. And then the question is, where does the benefit go? Does it go to the public in terms of more news and better product, or does it go to the company in terms of shareholder profit? I think most professional broadcasters try to balance that in a way that creates long-term benefit. So, as I said, if there's a company that is taking 100% of the cost cuts and trying to put that into their cash flow in the long run, there's other people in the market that'll serve that need and create more news. And the truth is, in this marketplace, there's no such thing as profits going to shareholders. If there's cost cuts, it is going to pay down bank debt and keep the company alive. So I don't think there's any greed involved in consolidation these days. I think it's providing more public service rather than less, and B, staying alive.
Just want to ask this question from the audience. Would a relaxation of ownership limitations provide more exit strategies that would be attractive to capital?
Probably. Exit strategies are always good.
Again, I think that's true. I think that, again, it's not going to change anything immediately, but these are all little things that would really help the business as it helps itself, as it pays down debt, as it gets itself in order. Those things would definitely help the business long term.
Both Mr. Jones and Mr. Peters talked about
needing to return a focus on the public interest. First of all, in the context of this discussion about ownership rules, I'll just ask the question most broadly. What do you think is in the greatest public interest in terms of how the FCC ought to approach ownership rules?
Again, everything I've said, you're going to have to sift through my theory and my philosophy as it applies to small market radio, not television, large or small. I'm a radio operator. I don't need you to tell me how to operate in the public interest. I don't need any rules to tell me how to operate in the public interest. I know how to operate in the public interest. I think that I am proud of the fact that we are the freest, I think I can safely make this statement, we are the freest broadcast system in the world as it applies to the ability to speak different, sometimes discordant points of view on our radio stations. That is what is in the public interest. One voice isn't necessarily in the public interest. 3 voices is definitely better in the public interest. When you get to 5 and 6 voices, now you're at a point where the radio stations can't afford to survive. And so consolidation is really a different issue. But as I said in my remarks, if we didn't have consolidation, we wouldn't be here. Because if I had to have 5 different properties and 5 general managers and 5 news staffs, and instead of 10 disc jockeys, 50 disc jockeys, I would not be able, the industry would not support it. Consolidation has been a good thing. Again, I go back to the point, I don't think you can legislate people paying attention to their mandate. I think the mandate has to be reinforced. But piles of paperwork and the fairness doctrine and all the rest of it isn't going to do it. You cannot mandate a sense of mission, and you can't mandate a sense of purpose. I don't know how you do that. I think that a lot of us have it inherent in how we run our operations.
I think on a broad level, it's in the public's best interest to have free radio and television over the air. There's no argument that they are the most local things you can get. Satellite radio is not local. Cable television channels are not local. These really are truly local mediums. And it would be a shame to see them threatened to such an extent economically that they didn't exist. And I agree with Terry that many of the things we're talking about here are to sustain the existing ownership base and preserve the industry. But if you don't preserve the industries, there's going to be no opportunity for anyone else to ever own them in the future. So you do have to preserve, I believe, the radio and television industries and not harm them further. I also agree that it is difficult to mandate and dictate the public interest. I had a meeting with a number of people, with a former FCC commissioner who's no longer at the commission, and he was adamant that we should be somewhat dictating to our audiences what they should be listening to. And that's not my job. My job is to ascertain what my community wants to hear and provide it, not tell them what they want to hear. So I think, it's a dicey game. What you think is in the public interest in terms of programming might not be what my community wants me to do. And so I think you have to trust the market forces. I think you have to trust the local broadcasters, because if I don't meet the needs of my community, they're not going to listen to me anymore, and then the advertisers aren't going to want to put ads on my station, and I won't be able to compete or do business. So there is an element of market factors there that protect you from that.
Sorry.
No, I'll just make a quick comment. The idea of consolidation, first of all, is not new. I think the radio industry's always had the ability to consolidate. It's just a question of how much. You used to be able to do 1 AM, 1 FM, and then it was 12 or whatever, and now it's doggone near unlimited, except for the rules that allow you to have, based on market size, only a certain number, and that, 8 in a major market in radio? And 7 radio and 1 television. So the question is, consolidation's always been allowed. It was just used to be 2, now it's 8, and that sort of thing. And cross ownership wasn't allowed for a period, and now we're talking about allowing it. So that's it. I'm not so much afraid of the market. I don't believe that, I majored in engineering, but I went to a liberal arts school, and they made me take liberal arts courses. And one of them was history, and we talked about the Hegelian dialectic, which talks about how history moves, how time and things move, and it talks about a thesis is created, and an antithesis to that thesis rises, and then out of that comes a synthesis. And if you look at this in the terms of that kind of movement of history, what really happens, and it happens in business as well, you have the creation of an industry, and then you often have a consolidation of that industry, and guess what? That the synthesis, or what next happens, is a new antithesis to that, which is the fragmentation, the refragmentation of that industry. And that's what we really have seen here, it seems to me, with this consolidation thing. There was an industry consolidated, and then now it's sort of fragmenting again, and out of that comes a new whole sort, that becomes the new thesis, and a new thing will come against that, and there'll be a synthesis, et cetera, and it'll keep moving. So you can't regulate that movement. All you can do is, in the context of the public interest, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the electromagnetic spectrum. Who owns it? Who should control it? What does it mean? That's your job. It's free. But the incumbents, certain people, and I'm not saying because they happen to be because they happen to be majority or white people that they should be taken away from, but they want to be protected. They don't want competition. They don't want to have to compete in this new antithesis that's happening with regard to technology. And I'm saying that it'll happen anyhow. That the industry will be revalued, it will be reconstituted, and there will be, I believe in the market forces, a new sort of industry that arises out of it. Your job is to say, if that happens, in my view, and I'm going to tell you what your job is, how do we protect the public interest? What's fair here? Should one company be able to own it all, or two or three or five, as we have in cable now, and et cetera? And is that in the public interest?
How would you answer that question?
I think there should be incentives to create the diversity that makes this country rich, that makes the world rich, et cetera. If you talk about the internet and about not only in foreign ownership, for example, which I talked about earlier, the internet allows foreign voices into this country already, right? So why are we limiting the ability of foreign investors to invest in broadcast in this country? I can go online and see the BBC or Deutsche Television or whatever anytime I want. I don't have to worry about those guys programming necessarily being negative in this country in terms of ownership in some reasonable amount. Now, the question is, again, you've got to decide what's reasonable. I don't necessarily want them to own 100% of a major outlet, perhaps, but the rules that they currently are structured prevent that capital from flowing, and this doesn't really make sense when you say that the internet is already there and they already can provide the voice. So there needs to be balance, there needs to be rules, there needs to be a bright line on the rules, but I think that where the Commission is now, quite frankly, in reality, is a reasonable place. And I don't think that necessarily further relaxation is great, except in the instances that of the cross ownership rules on these these industries that really need to be tied together so they can repurpose content and share expenses in order to survive. And I'm talking about newspaper, television, newspaper, radio in smaller markets and maybe even larger markets. That's not really a threat any longer.
I would love Mr. Jones. Thank you for taking the conversation down to one level further of granularity from the principles that we all ought to be looking at to how does it actually translate to what's the number, what's the actual rule, and I would like everyone else to do the same thing. You can start with two possible polls being what we have today. Say, well, I don't love it, but it's basically a reasonable place to be, or another end of the poll being get rid of it all. The market through the dialectic that you talk about, or through other checks and balances, will get to the right place, or something in between, or some completely new way of thinking about it. Could you take a dive into that?
I hope I haven't given you the impression that I'm for a total deregulation of this industry. I'm not. I am not having any problem with the current regulations competing and operating in my market. I don't find them to be extremely onerous. The cap on ownerships don't bother me. I have 3 FMs and an AM, and I could have a 4th, which actually I do under an LMA. That's totally sufficient. In my opinion, it gives us enough voices still on the market. And I don't have any comment about the logic of why can't 2 small market TV stations operate as a duopoly. It makes total sense to me. I have more of an issue with foreign ownership rules, but maybe that's just me being, I don't know, parochial? I'm not sure what the word is. But again, I go back, and I hate to be a flag waver all the time, that there's something special about this broadcasting system and the way it's evolved over the years. And I don't want to see anything change it, really. I'll tell you the best thing that the Commission has done, in my opinion, in the last year was the translator change rules, changing the translator rules. It allowed me to take a format and put it on an AM and then rebroadcast it in fill-in service on an FM, which was a format I wouldn't have taken a shot at. And I think it's going to make my AM station viable, and I think it's going to make a lot of AM stations viable. So I know I'm off topic there, but I don't want to get the impression that I think that the Commission is always meddling in our affairs. I think it's been a good relationship between broadcasters and the Commission up to this point. You do send cold ice through our veins when I hear things like, well, we think you should all have separate studios for in all your cities of licenses. That makes no sense. I do not want the KKK on my community advisory board. I really don't. Those things send ice through my veins. But as far as the general rules are concerned, I've had no problem competing. And after all, that's what this is about.
I think with regard to radio, we're probably in a pretty good, acceptable place. I'm sure there are people who would like more consolidation, more flexible rules, but personally, I think it works. It works. I think small market television desperately needs more flexibility. As I said before, they needed it before the economy crashed. They need it even more now. I also believe that allowing the cross-ownership with broadcast stations, both radio and television and newspapers, would benefit everyone. And I concur with the panel that there's enough voices there. I don't believe it would be harmful. And I think economically it would be to the benefit of all 3 industries. I also think that expanding foreign ownership is something that would be good to look at. I agree. I don't think 100% is where you want to go, but there is a lot of capital out there that already would love to be involved. And we have lenders, very honestly, that are foreign owned, and they can't even take a warrant position because of the existing regulations. I also think incentives, I have long believed that we should come back with something like the minority investment tax certificate. I think incentives for expanding diversity is the right thing to do. And it is something that we should be doing in this country, and it's something you should take a look at.
I'd agree with most of that. I think the radio ownership rules are in a pretty good place. I do think cross-ownership, print and broadcasting, would be a good thing economically, and I don't see how it does anything but help the public interest. I think small market TV cross-ownership, same thing. I think it's economically critical, and I think it would end up helping, not hurting, the public interest. I do think that the attribution rules, not the ownership rules, the attribution rules should be looked at with a common sense test and see if a single board seat and 5% ownership really is the right test. And I am in agreement with Susan on minority tax certificates. I think having some economic incentive for people to do smaller, trickier things would be a good thing. And then separate from the ownership, I do think if there's a way to put some support behind this notion of FM chips in cell phones, I think it would be enormous good for the radio industry. And if there's a way to get the different constituents together on the TV side, the networks, local TV stations, and the broadband providers to figure out how there's a partnership sharing the costs and benefits, but getting a second revenue stream to local TV stations, I think that would be critical. Because what we're really talking about here is preserving free, over-the-air, local and TV and radio. It's at a pretty critical juncture right now.
Thank you very much. I think Steve's question may have given you this opportunity already, but I'd like to give any of you an opportunity for a final observation or a parting shot, and then we'll close the proceeding.
Oh, I think I've said enough.
I'm good.
Well, thank you again. This workshop has been recorded. It will be part of the record in our rulemaking proceeding, and we very much appreciate your contribution to our analysis. Thanks very much.